Rotting from the top. The CFMU in Victoria during the Setka era. Introduction. 1. Attempted interference. What does the future hold? This report, Power and Corruption. 3, 4, 5, 6. 8 factors which wrecked the CFMU. 8. Sheer lawlessness. 8. The big build and big money. 9. Sidelining the EW. 10. The fear factor. 12. Mick Gatto. 13. John Setka. 15. Joe Miles. 16. Violence, Threats, and Extortion, Systemic Corruption, 1925. The introduction of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. 30. Manipulating the enterprise bargaining system. 30. Manipulating the rise of labor hire. 31. The appointment of unwanted and unnecessary delegates. 31. The appointment of friends and family to lucrative jobs. 35. The building industry. 2000. Slush fund. 38. Ad hoc corruption. Examples of ad hoc corruption. 41. Outlaw motorcycle gangs. 53. The risk created by OMCGs. 53. Bikies infiltrate the CFMU. 54. The struggle for control of Hurstbridge. 56. Enterprise bargaining agreements. 59%. Bribery. 60. The black market, buying and selling EBAs. 61. Awarding EBAs to friends. 62. Third-party EBA brokers. 63. Excluding enemies from EBAs. 65. Misuse and abuse of social procurement schemes. 66% misuse and abuse of Aboriginal business EBAs. 66. Labor 70 money, the root of the problem. 70. How wide does the corruption spread? 71. Ghost shifts. 72. Organized crime. 74. Crime figures and criminals favored by the CFMU. 75. Organized crime methods associated with the CFMU. 86. A crossover with the tobacco wars. 88. The case studies. 90. Case study 1. Case study 2. The Hawthorn East bashing. Case study 3. Case study 4. Case study 5. 2. Unwanted health and safety reps. Case study 6. Who wants to work in Occo? Case study 7. John Perkovic's real estate. Case study 8. John Perkovic's motor cars. Case study 10. Luke Moloney joins the CFMEU. Case study 11. Everybody gets to eat. Case study 12. Case study 13. Faruk Orman and ZK infrastructure. Case study 14. Billy Mitris, Elias Spernovasilis, and X-Force. Case study 15, Mick Gatto's M Group. Case study 16, Gatto, We Can Cause You Grief. Case study 17, Muhammed Sayan, and the Tobacco Wars. Case study 1890, 91, 95, 96, 99, 10, 110, 4108, 11, 95, 95, 96, 9. Introduction. 1. Something went wrong with the CFMU during the John Setka era. Before Setka, the CFMU was a great trade union. Yes, it was militant, but always lawful, and its only objective was the best interests of its members. The pre-Setka CFMU brought about great change, not just in the industrial sphere, but in society in general. The old CFMU was the founder of superannuation for working-class Australians. The old CFMU was the principal proponent for the creation of the living wage. At the time, these ideas were thought radical. Now they are accepted as fundamental features of a fair Australian society. 2. But from those great heights, the CFMU in Victoria collapsed into a squalid mess. It slid from being a union which fought hard for workers to one which started a fight just for the sake of it. It devolved from being a union which honored the dignity of working Australians to a union which cultivated the company of underworld figures. It deteriorated from being progressive, tolerant, and respectful into a violent, hateful, greedy rabble. It degenerated from being a union where people were respected for their honesty and decency to one where a good person, a decent person who spoke out against corruption, was shouted down and told they were a dog or a rat or even a cunt. 3. The cause of the collapse of the CFMU was not from within, it came from the top. 4. If you wish to know what went wrong with the CFMU, then you need to look no further than its leadership over the last 20 years. The CFMU was pushed in the wrong direction. 5. The previous style of CFMU leadership is typified by this email recently sent by Setka in response to a request by the administration to produce some information about how members' money had been spent. Go fuck yourself, Irving, and fuck Keo. You fucking dogs have endangered my life with all your leaks to the media, and I will come into the office whenever I want. You have leaked my personal information to the media and put my life in grave danger and caused me all sorts of grief. I'm not a Alp stooge like you two cunts, so along with all the other fuckers like Flynn. So go fuck your mothers with Mackenzie, and while you're fucking them, get your noses out of Albo's ass, and tell on the union's money, and stop leaking my confidential information to the media and endangering my life and that of my family. One more leak, you dogs, and I'll fix it myself. So do everyone a favor and go and knock yourselves. 6. This is a report into what went wrong in the CFMEU during the Setka era. That era started around the time of Setka's election as secretary in 2012. It ended on August 23, 2024, on the appointment of the administrator. As a result of the administration, those who are identified in this report, the leaders of the CFMEU, were removed from office. Over the life of the administration, their influence over the branch has slowly waned and, in the case of many of the former leaders, been completely extinguished. 7. Change trickled down. The next level of leadership within the union, the organizers, have in many cases been removed over the course of the administration. None of the organizers identified negatively in this report are currently employed by the administration. Since August 2024, over 50% of the employees of the Victorian branch have ended their employment with the union or had it ended for them. 8. The John Setka era is over. It is incapable of resurrection. The administrator is considering steps to discipline Setka under the CFMEU rules. That might include expulsion, which would make Setka ineligible to stand for any union office. Further, as a removed person under the Fair Work Act 2009, Setka can only stand for office if the Fair Work Commission was satisfied that he was a fit and proper person. In light of what will be revealed in this report, it is unlikely that the Commission would arrive at that view. 9. Conducting this investigation has been a challenging experience for me. As a lifelong believer in trade unions, it was shocking to see so much crime, so much corruption, such a perversion of values. The CFMU was no longer on the right side of civil society, it was proudly on the wrong side. The union was no longer the champion of the working class. The Setka-era CFMU turned to looking after gangsters, standover men, bikies, heroin traffickers, and even killers. By the end of this investigation, I have been left with the empty feeling that the Setka-led Victorian branch of the CFMU was no longer a trade union, it was a crime syndicate. This was a uniquely Victorian problem. Preparing various reports has provided an opportunity to get a feel for the different operations in the different states, and to compare the problems faced in each. It is quite clear that the problems in Victoria were exponentially worse, and far more dangerous than elsewhere. 12. Something had to change. For effective change to occur, the power and influence of these malignant characters who have dragged down the CFMU had to be broken. The problem is that their power and influence was strong, deeply rooted, and widespread. The only way to break that influence was to smash it. The action had to be swift and sharp and severe. In effect, it had to be a regime change. Attempted interference. 13. The criminal forces either behind or within Setka's CFMU took extreme measures to try to disrupt the administration, to stop the reform of the Victorian branch, and to prevent further exposure of what was going on in the CFMEU. They failed. 15. The administration commenced in August 2024. By October 2024, federal intelligence agencies had already received information that the life of the administrator, Mark Irving KC, was under threat. It is not appropriate for operational reasons to go into the detail of the intelligence gathered, but it is enough to say that the information was reliable, the threat was real, and the plot was obviously professional. Since then, Irving has required continuous personal protection. He continues his work undeterred. 17. The threats ramped up. The Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally McManus, and the then Minister for Workplace Relations, Murray Watt, both required their own personal security. There was also strong opposition to the investigative reporting that exposed the problems in the Setka-era CFMEU. 19. Nick Mackenzie is the investigative journalist who brought the abuses of the Setka-held CFMU to public attention. His reporting led to the creation of the administration. Mackenzie deserves the credit for any good which comes from all of this. This report, for example, is merely following in his wake. He has made a remarkable contribution to society. 20. Apparently others do not agree. 21. Mackenzie has twice been forced out of his home due to credible threats to his safety. The original threat came directly from a very violent and very dangerous man. More recently, Mackenzie has been forced out after attacks on his home, including the disablement of his home security system. 22. The threats backfired. The only result was that Mackenzie ramped up his work. 23. There have also been threats regarding this investigation. 24. Soon after this investigation commenced, threats of violence were made against senior CFMU officials because they were lagging, i.e. speaking to me. The officials who reported this claimed to be scared for their personal safety. The persistent threat of violence hampered the conduct of this investigation. Several potential witnesses said they would not speak to me because they had been warned not to cooperate. Some did speak, but it would be dangerous to recount their stories. It will suffice to say that I was shown and told of evidence of explicit threats made by dangerous men, some with convictions for violence. What does the future hold? 6. The matters addressed in this report are now matters of history. Making a record of that kind is both necessary and helpful. It is important to record what went wrong as part of identifying the path for the process of correction. It will also help prevent it from happening again. 27. There are some dark events recorded in this report. But the future is not all gloom. Even though the problems in Victoria have been especially severe, there are already clear signs that the CFMU has changed. 28. The administration has been in place for 18 months, and it is clear that the process of reform is having a positive effect. First, there is the experience in the other states. The signs are positive. The problems seen in NSW, in Queensland, and which were emerging in South Australia, have already been brought largely under control. 29. In Victoria, there are positive signs too. The rate at which the CFMEU has been prosecuted for industrial breaches has dried up. There are continuing industrial disputes, but far fewer than were occurring before the administration. The fear of violence is still there, but not as intense as it was before. 30. One experienced contractor with over 20 years in the building sector, Mauritius, told How in early 2024 he had made up his mind that he could no longer be part of the corruption. Then the administration commenced. He has already seen positive change and is hopeful for more. 31. When the administration arrived, a number of the most problematical characters were removed. That had an immediate positive impact, but those men continued to exercise a kind of shadow control through organizers and delegates who remained loyal to them. 32. Slowly at first, but more rapidly recently, a number of those organizers have also gone. In the last few weeks, over a dozen organizers have been sacked or have taken voluntary redundancy. Change has begun. 33. It is a matter of some concern to me that what follows in this report is so overwhelmingly negative. That needs to be placed into perspective. 34. There are over 30,000 members of the Victorian CFMEU, and 99% of them are honest. Introduction. Men and women working hard in a difficult and sometimes dangerous workplace. This report is not about them. This report is about the officials who abuse the trust of the general membership. Hopefully, this report and its effect will be of benefit to the vast majority of honest members of the CFMEU. This report. 35. This report is divided into two parts. The first is a narrative of the crime and corruption of the Setka-era CFMEU. The second comprises 18 case studies, all of which predate the commencement of the administration. In both parts, there were many other stories which could have been told. There was a need to be selective. 36. Hundreds of potential witnesses were approached. Many volunteered assistance. A substantial number refused. A smaller number were interviewed under compulsion. 37. To reduce the risk of reprisals, where it is unnecessary to identify an individual or a business a pseudonym is used. 38. This report contains some strong findings. Adverse findings have been made only where I have been satisfied that the conclusion is correct and that the criticism is justified. Wherever there was a doubt, the benefit of that doubt has been given to the person who could be adversely affected. Power and corruption. 39. Some of those interviewed suggested the cause of the deterioration of the CFMEU's conduct was the abolition of the Australian Building and Corruption Commission in 2022. That cannot be right. The problems in the CFMEU were occurring well before then. In fact, the conduct of the CFMEU was worsening during the period the ABCC was in operation. You need to go back before 2022, at least back to 2015, probably earlier. 40. Two things are constant: the leadership of John Setka and his team and the role of the Big Build. Things went badly downhill when the Big Build really got going in 2015. 41. An experienced person with an important role in the construction sector, Headingley, was asked for his opinion as to how and why the problems with the Setka-led CFMEU came about. It was a perfect storm. All of a sudden, there was too much government money and too many really big jobs. There was a shortage of labor, and the CFMEU had all the negotiation power, and from that, too much power generally. 42. That is an insightful observation. The big money generated by the Big Build was at the root of the problem in Victoria. The temptation created by the big money proved too great. 43. But Headingley's observation is incomplete. It glosses over the poisonous role played by some critical individuals both inside and outside the CFMEU. These individuals will be named and their conduct identified in this report. Some of the names will be well known, but some of the names and some of the stories of what they did and how they did it will be new. 44. It is obvious that there were multiple factors which contributed to the decline and fall of the CFMEU. 8 of these factors have been selected to be discussed just below in this section of the report. There were other factors, but these 8 factors seem especially important. But before going to that, there is a need to understand how power was distributed within the Victorian CFMEU. 46. The power structure of the CFMEU was partly formal, partly informal. For the purpose of this report, the formal part is split in 3. An executive of 6 senior elected officials, about 60 organizers, and about 600 delegates, 1. Together, the elected. Executive, the organizers, and the delegates are the officials of the CFMEU, about 247. But outside the formalities, there was a group, a small group, of real power brokers. These power brokers really controlled the affairs of the CFMEU. The CFMEU was an autocracy, not a democracy. These former power brokers held the power between themselves and were not willing to share it. There were never any contested elections for the executive positions. They were resolved privately and long before anyone got to vote. There were even instances where the election of delegates has been undone or ignored, and the member's choice replaced by the executive's preferred candidate. 48. These former CFMEU power brokers included the 6 members of the executive, some organizers, and a few of the most powerful delegates. They were about 20 people in a union with 30,000 members. This small group was not concerned with laws or union rules. They had little regard or respect for the general membership. They ran the CFMEU for their own profit and their own benefit. Several of them were deeply corrupt. 49. The power brokers were in 3 groups, 50. The first comprised the executive or the senior elected officials, John Setka, Derek Christopher, Elias Spernovasilis, Joe Miles, and to a lesser extent, Mick Miles and Rob Grauman's. 51. The second comprised powerful organizers, John Perkovic, Steve Long, Paul Tsemis, Jerry McCrudden, Joel Shackleton, Andrew DeBono, Jerry McQuaid, Rob Jonjic, and Frank Akbari. 52. The third group comprised powerful or well-connected delegates. For example, Rudy Rasputic and Lee Bozic. were very close to Setka. Joel Levitt and Johnny Two Guns Walker were closely connected to Joe Miles. 53. Another feature of how power was distributed in the CFMEU is that it was controlled by two main factions. 54. One was led by John Setka. It is usually called the Setka faction. This faction was based on the construction side of the union's industrial coverage. It comprised half of the executive, most of the organizers, and about 160 of the delegates. 55. The other faction was controlled by Joe Miles. Its core was a powerful group of officials who came to Victoria in about 2014. It was based on the civil side of the union's coverage. It is not clear just how many were within this faction, but it was smaller in number than the Setka faction. That said, it was just as powerful as the Setka faction. This faction was usually known as the civil faction, or the Miles faction. Competition between those factions explains some of the problems which will be discussed in this report. 8 factors which wrecked the CFMEU. 57. Returning to the issue of the reasons for the deterioration in the CFMEU, these are the 8 factors mentioned above. The CFMEU's growing contempt and disrespect for the law, the rapid increase in money which became available through the Big Build, the CFMEU's taking over civil sites and workers ordinarily covered by the AWU, a growing fear amongst contractors that the CFMEU would use its power to damage them, the governmental inaction on the CFMEU, and the influence of each of Mick, Gatto, John Setka, and Joe Miles, sheer lawlessness. 58. The CFMEU held the law in contempt. 59. In 2015, Justice Mortimer said the CFMEU had a conscious and deliberate strategy to engage in disruptive, threatening, and abusive behavior, and that this was without regard to the lawfulness of its actions, and that it was impervious to the prospect of prosecution and penalties. 60. In the decade from 2015 to August 2024, it got worse, not better. 61. The statistics surrounding the CFMEU's consistent and serious breaches of industrial law are shocking. Since 2003, the CFMEU, its officials and members, have been convicted of more than 2,600 offenses and fined over $28 million. These breaches, especially in Victoria, often involved violence. 62. The rate and seriousness of the offending was disproportionate to the way in which the other major unions conducted themselves. It is not an answer to say that the CFMEU's convictions occurred because the building industry is hard, tough, or edgy. The fact is that the other building unions have few or no convictions. 63. Many judges have observed while imposing fines on the CFMEU that punishment was having little or no deterrent effect because the CFMEU regarded the fines as a cost of doing business. I do not agree. The multiple breaches and heavy fines were all part of the Setka-led CFMEU's business model. The CFMEU was flaunting its lawlessness as a warning to others that it did not obey the rules. 64. The CFMEU's utter disregard for the law had a poisonous effect. The CFMEU was in constant battle with Victoria Police. The CFMEU's attitude to the law and to the police made the union amenable to crime and corruption. 65. Under the administration, the union has developed a cooperative relationship with the Victorian Police and the AFP. No regulator has alleged that the union has contravened any industrial law since the administration commenced. The Big Build and Big Money. 66. The Big Build comprises those massive infrastructure projects currently underway in Victoria. By the time it is complete, more than $100 billion will have been spent on the Big Build. There are 5 types of projects: new roadworks, new rail lines and stations, the creation of underground rail links, the removal of 110 level crossings, and the creation of the Westgate Tunnel. 67. It is estimated that 20,000 jobs have been created directly by the Big Build and another 40,000 indirectly. 68. The advent of the Big Build gave the CFMEU a strong position to negotiate better terms and conditions for its members. Labor became scarce. The unions held the power during negotiations over work conditions. The result was higher pay and better entitlements. Unskilled laborers working on the Big Build were entitled to a base salary of over $1,900 per week, but together with loadings and payments to Incolink, for superannuation, for long service leave, for overtime and shift work, this salary was substantially increased. 69. The flood of government money also made the Big Build ripe for corruption, ad hoc corruption on the part of former organizers and delegates, as well as more. Organized or systemic corruption involving collaboration by some elements in the CFMEU with outlaw motorcycle gangs and other crime outfits. 70. As one example of the latter kind, some of the large building sites were converted by OMCGs into drug distribution centers. Picture 200 or more men aged between 18 and 30, each earning well over $100,000, confined within the area of a single building site. That is a drug dealer's dream. Rival bikie gangs were fighting to get control over the individual sites. 71. In fact, a laborer's job on the Big Build is so lucrative that a market was created where corrupt organizers and delegates bought and sold the jobs. There are plenty of stories of people who were willing to pay to get an unskilled job paying well over $100,000 a year. 72. Several witnesses gave accounts of those who previously held the power selling Big Build jobs for an upfront cash payment. A few witnesses described how a powerful delegate, Joel Levitt, required potential workers to pay him a sum to get a job in the first place and an occasional payment to keep it. It was well known that a manager at Top Up Labor was being paid by employees of that business, so they might be appointed to the more lucrative shifts. There was another scam worked on the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop. A man who worked on that site, Brideshead, told how potential workers had to donate $100 in cash to former CFMEU officials for a concocted charitable purpose in order to be allocated a lucrative shift. On occasions, there would be 100 men working on a weekend night shift. $100 by 100 workers equal to $10,000, sidelining the AWU. Sidelining the AW covers construction work, the Australian Workers' Union covers civil work. Plainly, much of the recent major work in Victoria on the Big Build is civil work, not construction work. The Big Build sites should be dominated by members of the AWU. 74. But that is not the case. In fact, it is the opposite. As Headingley described it, there are still a few AW members to be seen in the tunnels, but there are none on the surface. A former AW organizer, Cardiff, lamented, "We only have the tunnel now." 75. How did this come about? 76. One explanation is that through a combination of violence and intimidation, the CFMEU drove the AW off civil sites all over Melbourne. Civil for day 77. This started in about 2014 when a group of officials moved to Melbourne. Joe Miles, Mick Miles, Marty Albert, Joel Levitt, Kane Pearson, Adam Olsen, and others. Setka accommodated the newcomers by handing them control over the civil jurisdiction. Before that, the civil section of the CFMEU was small and comparatively weak. 78. Joe Miles was ambitious. He grabbed the chance. He immediately became very aggressive in the civil space, interfering when the AW was organizing its members, initiating industrial action where it was unnecessary, threatening contractors with industrial action unless they engaged CFMEU-aligned subcontractors, and insisting that, to win an EBA, a contractor would be required to force its employees to switch membership to the CFMEU. One example was dealt with by the High Court of Australia. Joe Miles had insisted that a large builder appoint a CFMEU delegate onto an AW civil site, and when the builder refused, he blockaded the site and stopped the concrete pour. 879. That was only one of many instances of this kind. 80. There was physical aggression as well. An AW organizer, Edgbaston, described CFMEU organizers and delegates pushing and shoving AW officials and site superintendents. Edgbaston described how several civil engineers, who were mere bystanders to the thuggery, became unwilling to go on site due to the potential for violence. 81. Eventually, most contractors capitulated to the CFMEU, giving in to the persistent pressure just to buy short-term industrial peace. 82. Contractors who resisted suffered. This was a typical story. The full details are included in a case study. 83. There are several stories of that kind in this report. The practical effect of the CFMEU asserting control over civil sites was to enlarge the scope of its coverage, to increase its power, and to reduce competition. 84%. An idea of how much the changeover from the AWU to the CFMEU has cost the taxpayer on the Big Build can be taken from the experience of traffic management. 85. A builder commander had years of experience of letting traffic management contracts to AWU companies for $70 to $80 an hour. Joe Miles then came on the scene, explained that the CFMEU would now be controlling these contracts. Miles said that if the builders did not acquiesce in his demands, he would close the sites. The builders had no choice. The hourly rates for traffic control were jacked up to $110 to $120 per hour. Commander estimates that this cost the Victorian taxpayer $50 million to $60 million on the Northeast Link alone. 86. Another example, a Tier 1 executive, Mark, explained that on the level crossings removal project that the contractors with Abueba simply gave up trying to get and keep the work. Prices were only received from CFMEU-aligned contractors, immediately forcing up labor costs by 20%, and this was on a labor-intensive $360 million project, costing the taxpayer another $50 million plus. 87. There is another issue. The AWU and CFMU have vastly different models of operating. Under the AW model, there is comparatively little union involvement between negotiating EBAs. Under this servicing model, the AWU plays a reactive role, providing services when necessary when responding to a particular issue. Under the CFMU run by Setka, the model was proactive. Members were organized to act collectively and to act loudly. There was often a full-time CFMU delegate placed on larger sites, and there was a deeper involvement in OHS and site issues on a daily basis. Each model has its merits. Each reflects a different view on what a union is and does. But the CFMU model had a greater potential for trouble. The fear factor, 88. This is where its lawlessness and its reputation for lawlessness really paid off for the CFMU. 89%. Contractors were aware that even if there was no legal nor rational basis for industrial action, the CFMU would take industrial action and close building sites indefinitely. This presented an existential threat to some builders. Site stoppages are very costly. Another favored tactic was for a CFMEU organizer to threaten to prevent or delay a concrete pour. 90. There are many examples of this kind of conduct in this report. The evidence of it is indisputable. The CFMEU was prosecuted and heavily fined for repeated, obvious legal breaches. But, as mentioned above, the convictions and the fines were ineffective in stopping the conduct. If they were fined one day, the CFMEU was likely to return and do the very same thing the very next day. 91. Once the CFMEU showed it was unwilling to obey the law, and that it was immune to the deterrent of a fine, there was no realistic practical response open to contractors apart from capitulation. 92. There was another real reason why contractors and regulators started avoiding conflict with the CFMEU. The CFMEU was actively employing criminals. During the Setka era, the CFMEU was forcing contractors to employ patched bikies, meth abusers, violent standover men, killers, boxers, and cage fighters. The CFMEU was sending a message. It was to be feared and it was not to be opposed. 93. The CFMEU succeeded in casting a shadow of fear over the whole building sector. Mick Gatto. 94. Mick Gatto has been a malignant influence on the CFMEU for decades. 95. Gatto claims he is a mediator and arbitrator, but others, including a federal judge, say he is a standover man and a gangster, closely associated with a number of violent and dangerous criminals in Melbourne and violent criminals in Sydney and members of bikie gangs. 10. This has been recognized for a long time. In 2003, the National Crime Authority named Gatto as the head of a criminal network. 96. Gatto has boasted of strong relations with the CFMEU. He says they go back over 40 years. It is little wonder Gatto speaks fondly of the CFMEU. It has made him tens of millions of dollars. Figure 1, Mick Gatto, a gangster, a standover man, and a close friend of the Victorian CFMEU. 97. Gatto's connections with the former leadership of the CFMEU started at the top. He is best mates with John Setka. His connections with the CFMEU were so powerful that Gatto could order the CFMEU to stop work on any building site. Gatto told a developer attempting to finish a project, "I can stop anyone doing anything, mate." In the same context, he boasted publicly that people will do as he says because they're worried about my union connections. As an example of the preferential treatment he received, one year the CFMEU invited both Gatto and Premier Dan Andrews to its annual grand final breakfast. A message came back from Andrews' office suggesting that if Gatto was attending, the Premier would not. When he heard this, Setka laughed and said, "Fuck the Premier." Gatto was given a seat at the head table. 99. The administration had taken steps to eliminate or reduce the influence Gatto has over the CFMEU. Yet, in October 2025, when a dispute arose at the airport with the contractor, Maz Group, an organizer, Costa Josephidis, was either sent or given permission by the National Secretary, Zach Smith, to attend a meeting with Gatto. There is a suggestion that Smith wanted Josephidis to organize the meeting in a place where he would not be seen in the company of Gatto. 100. This incident could be interpreted in different ways. There is no doubt that it was a massive judgment failure by Smith, but an additional way of viewing it is to underline the apparent bond between Gatto and the CFMEU. 16. 101. There will be many examples of Gatto's criminal conduct in this report. Gatto has damaged the building industry and damaged the Victorian economy, maybe permanently. Everybody knows what he's been doing. Repeated inquiries, including royal commissions, have singled out Gatto as a criminal, yet he seems to survive. 102. Now is the time for change. Now is the time finally to break Gatto's malignant influence over the CFMEU and the Victorian building industry. Now is the time to get rid of Gatto once and for all. John Setka. 103. Given there was information available which was adverse to John Setka, he deserved an opportunity to address it. I asked Setka to meet me. He responded, "I warn you, Watson, you should hope you never cross my path, so go and fuck your mom in Irving's and leave me alone, you fucking fat, ugly cunt." 104. It will thus be necessary to proceed with only limited assistance from Mr. Setka. 105. It probably does not matter, because it is unlikely that Setka could have said anything which would have assisted. It is clear that Setka's leadership dragged the CFMEU down from a position of esteem and into a pit of crime and corruption. The decline in the CFMEU coincided with Setka's rise. 106. It is hard to understand how Setka's dominance came about. The personal characteristics which might make Setka a leader are not immediately apparent to an outsider. He is very aggressive. He is abusive. He has, as this report will demonstrate, close personal and financial links to organized crime and other criminal connections. He is corrupt. He has his own criminal record, including a conviction for domestic abuse, 107, but still he held sway, 108. Setka did not act alone. He surrounded himself with corrupt cronies. Some were from within the union, others were from outside, power and corruption, 109. From the inside, the former senior elected officials Derek Christopher and Elias Spernovasilis were close allies. He was supported by powerful organizers, especially John Perkovic and Steve Long. The problem with this was that these men were corrupt, known to be corrupt, and were promoted and protected by Setka. 110. From outside the union, there were connections with serious underworld figures and corrupt coppers, Mick Gatto and Jadran Delik and Ante Jurek, and even members of the Mockbell gang. 111. The impact of Setka as secretary was to create and entrench a corrupt leadership of the union. Figure 2, John Setka. God forgives, the CFMEU doesn't. Joe Miles. 112. The circumstances of Joe Miles arriving at the Victorian branch were described earlier. 113. Once Miles was handed control of the civil work of the Victorian branch, he set out to expand the civil coverage and build a power base. His plan was, eventually, to become the secretary of the CFMEU. He cultivated the Young Activists Network, a group of ambitious young members hoping one day to be promoted as a delegate, or organizer. There will be several places in this report where criticism is made of Joe Miles and his tactics. The general nature of these matters were raised with Miles in correspondence. Miles responded by denying any wrongdoing and stating he had only ever acted in the best interest of CFMEU members. He claimed information to the contrary was provided by third parties with an ulterior motive. 115. There were two problems for the CFMEU arising from this. The first was that Miles was ruthless in driving the AW off civil sites and was quite happy to use threats, especially threats of unwarranted industrial stoppages, to force contractors to capitulate to his demands. He did not mind getting his hands dirty. In 2017, Justice Tracy of the federal court described Miles as having a deplorable history of offending. His convictions related to threats backed up with stoppages and blockades. 116. The second was that, no doubt as part of his plan to drive the AW off civil sites, Miles surrounded himself with a group of unusually violent and aggressive officials. Amongst the organizers were Marty Albert, Joel Shackleton, Jerry McCrudden 19, Andrew DeBono 20, and Luke Collier. At one stage, Miles was close to another powerful organizer, Paul Themis 21, but they fell out. 117. Several of Miles' circle were bikies or former bikies. Several had convictions for violent crimes. One had killed a man. Others were convicted drug traffickers and known drug users. Shackleton was a professional boxer with close personal ties to Gatto. Some were drawn from the young activists who were trying to establish their reputation as enforcers. 118. Below is a photograph taken of Miles and 3 members of his crew at a concert. 18. See Australian Building and Construction Commission, CFMEU, FCA, 1555, FCA. Jerry McCrudden has a 2024 conviction for making intimidatory threats to a health and safety manager in the event they cooperated with the Australian Building and Construction Commission. Andrew DeBono has a serious reputation for violence. He also has a close association with Mick Gatto and intervened on several occasions to secure EBAs for Faruk Orman and for Orman's wife. He is particularly known for setting up industrial disputes so they can be mediated by Gatto. CMS has an appalling record of industrial prosecutions with at least 9 convictions since 2021. These attracted personal fines in the order of $60,000. CMS was described as Joe Miles' attack dog. In 2023, the concert featured Nas and Wu-Tang Clan. The passes they are wearing are VIP passes which had cost in the order of $800 each, except they did not need to pay for them. The passes were a gift from a grateful contractor. Figure 3, Joe Miles and the Wu-Tang Clan. 119. From left to right, the men in the photograph are Luke Collier. When he was a CFMU official, he was convicted for calling a female inspector from the Fair Work Commission a fucking slut, and then asking if she had brought her knee pads as you were going to be sucking off these dogs all day. Collier has convictions for assault occasioning actual bodily harm and for aggravated assault on his girlfriend. Joe Miles, his deplorable history has been dealt with above. Joel Levitt, a senior figure in the Rebels OMCG, Levitt will figure often in this report. He is responsible for repeated episodes of threats, violence, and corruption. He was Joe Miles' agent on the troublesome Hurstbridge site where the rebels finally took control. Jamal Pearson, another patched rebel who was recently convicted for arson related to Melbourne's tobacco wars. 120. Joe Miles propelled these men and others like them into positions of power. This was a step toward making violent, threatening conduct a staple of CFMEU negotiation tool. When unleashed, the members of this crew dragged the CFMU ever deeper into a criminal cycle. The criminal members of Miles' crew introduced their own cronies into the union. More bikies, more drug dealers, more violence. Violence. 121. Violence was an accepted part of the way in which the Victorian building sector did business. To be fair, the violence came from both sides, some from the CFMU and some from virulently anti-union employers. It is not easy to discern cause from effect. 122. What is clear is that the threat of violence in the building industry was pervasive. It sat behind every demand, every request. The only certain way to avoid violence was by capitulating to demands or by making payments to underworld figures and standover men. 123. There was no desire from within the CFMEU to stop the violence. When the former Assistant Secretary Derek Christopher was asked about violence on the part of CFMEU members, he brushed it off by blaming the bosses. I could give you 1,000 cases where workers have been stood over and bashed. When asked if he had ever gone to the police with that information, with a view to protecting his members, he said, all the police do is turn around and go after the unions. 124. In other words, the police were kept out of it, and so the cycle of violence continued. 125. There are so many examples of instances of violence that it is hard to know where to start, and once started, it is almost impossible to stop. This is merely a single, stock standard example of how it works, taken from a decision of a federal court Judge 22 and involving a former top-level organizer, John Perkovic. 126. The judge recorded that Perkovic approached a building industry inspector and, at least 5 times, shouted at the inspector that he was a piece of shit or a fucking piece of shit or a cunt. The judge found that there was a confrontation between the two men which went this way. Inspector, you're hindering and obstructing me in the execution of my duty. Perkovic, do you want a fucking photo, you fucking piece of shit? Inspector, don't touch me, get away from me. Perkovic, you're just about having a heart attack. You're shitting yellow, you piece of shit. Go fuck, brush your teeth next time, you piece of shit. Alright, you fucking coward, I'd fucking take you to school, you fucking piece of shit. 127. It is also difficult to report on the subject of violence because it would be dangerous to repeat some of the underlying stories. There are instances of hired assassins. Violence, death threats, bashings, firebombings, it goes on. Fear lingers. In some instances, witnesses would speak out, say they felt relieved to tell their story, and yet ring the next day asking for their story to be left out of this report. 128. Below are just a few examples of a day in the life of the Setka-era CFMEU, the Hawthorn East bashing. 129. This was a disturbing incident, not just because of the level of violence involved, but because of Setka's CFMEU's lack of response to two of its organizers being bashed and seriously injured. Essentially, Setka and the leadership covered up the incident and left the injured workers on their own. 130. On June 30th, 2022, senior CFMEU organizers Ronnie Buckley and Paul Simas were badly bashed on a development site in Hawthorn East. Everybody knows who organized and inflicted the bashing, yet there has been no police action taken. Why? Because Setka and the former CFMEU leadership stopped the investigation. 131. This matter is described in detail in a case study. For present purposes, it is sufficient to recount that Buckley lost the use of an eye, and Simas suffered a severely fractured ankle. Naturally, the police were concerned and came to see Buckley and Simas, but Buckley had been told by Setka not to cooperate. No, you're not going to the police, that's a dog act. 132. Instead, the matter was resolved privately. The site was controlled by Rahman Shakiri, who seems to be known as Ray the Albanian. Shakiri brought in Mick Gatto to represent him. Setka and other senior officials were involved in the negotiations. There were repeated rumors that a substantial amount of money changed hands, something in the order of $200,000, but none of that money made its way to Buckley or Tsimas. It remains unclear as to who pocketed the money. Figure 4, welcome back Mick Gatto arrives at the CFMEU offices with Ray the Albanian to negotiate over the Hawthorn East bashing. Ray is in the orange jacket, John Perkovic is behind him. Gatto is to the right of both. Andrew De Bono's Coward's Punch, 133. On November 16, 2023, the former organizer, Andrew De Bono, attended a meeting where two contractors were sorting out a contract dispute. It is hard to understand why De Bono was even there, but he appeared to be representing a firm known as Base Piling. Base Piling wanted money from a large contractor. 134. Base Piling was owned by the convicted heroin dealer, J. Malkoon. 135. Why the CFMEU was involved in a private money dispute remains a mystery. Why the CFMEU was involved on the side of a heroin dealer is disconcerting. 137. De Bono then swung a punch into the back of the contractor's head, the classical coward's punch. 25. Figure 5. Andrew De Bono, if provoked, will strike. 138. The incident was reported to the CFMEU head office, but naturally De Bono was not even disciplined. The Mardadandi incident. 139. On February 16, 2022, a chance encounter between the former CFMEU organizers Joel Shackleton and Jerry McCrudden and the owners of a small Aboriginal labor hire business erupted into a frenzy. This is the subject of a case study. 140. This kind of spontaneous violence was a common event, especially when dealing with Shackleton. The difference is that this meeting was recorded on a video. 141. The trigger was that the business owners had been seeking the renewal of a CFMEU EBA from Shackleton. Shackleton accepted that he was refusing to work with Marta Dandy and said it was because they employed too many white fellas. When the two groups met, Shackleton quickly called on one man to fight him and added, "I'd kick your head in." He then turned to the second man and said, "You think I won't fuck you up too? I will fucking end you, cunt." 143. The most remarkable claim by Shackleton to one of the men was, "I'll fucking take your soul and I'll rip your fucking head off." Violence. 144. His parting words were, "Don't fuck with me, cunt." 145. These words on a page cannot convey Shackleton's anger and hostility. 146. The former CFMEU leadership's response was to close ranks. Shackleton reported the incident to Elias Spernovasilis. He responded by directing union funds be used to install security cameras at Shackleton's home for Shackleton's personal protection. Shackleton had been a professional boxer. 147. Many informants told of similar incidents not just involving Shackleton. The firebombings. 148. Since the second half of 2024, the building sector has suffered a series of firebombings. There have been more than 10 attacks. All have occurred at night. Most have occurred at building sites or at industrial premises, but at least one has been at a private home. 149. No one has been injured or killed yet. 150. Information regarding these fires was provided to this investigation. The details are too sensitive and the potential consequences too serious to reveal them in this report. It will be sufficient to say that there are good reasons to believe those perpetrating the fire bombings are underworld figures enjoying a close relationship with the former power brokers in the CFMEU. It seems likely there is OMCG involvement. 151. On September 16, 2025, 3 men were arrested in respect of 2 of the fire bombings. It is too early to comment further. Just watch this space. Violence toward women. 152. Given its leader is a convicted domestic abuser, it is hardly a surprise that misogyny was rife in the Victorian CFMEU. 153. A health and safety manager from one of the Tier 1 builders, Surrey, worked on several sites around the big build. He described the treatment of women as incredibly awful. He said the arrangements were toxic and dangerous for women. 154. Surrey explained that there were highly paid but lighter or menial jobs reserved for women. Some positions involved cleaning and another position reserved for a woman was on traffic control. These jobs were unskilled, but combined with overtime and shift payments, they paid over $100,000. Violence, or more. The women were eager to get the work. 155. While Surrey supported the scheme, he said the truth was that these jobs were often just given to friends of CFMEU officials. He did not find that a surprise, but then he discovered that some of the women were being recruited from strip clubs. During the night shift, the men would pay cash to have the women perform in the site shed. 156. When Surrey heard about this, he shut it down immediately on his sites, but it is not clear how far and wide this was occurring. Threats and extortion. 157. Threats of violence were a common part of business in the Victorian building sector and a common part of the business of the CFMEU. 158. Threats of violence were used by the CFMEU for all kinds of reasons, but, relevantly, threats were used to drive the AWU off building sites, or to collect debts, or for the purpose of extortion. The removal of the AWU was dealt with earlier. The ugly business of debt collection will be dealt with later in the section on organized crime. Here the focus will be on extortion. 159. Extortion was also common in the Victorian building sector. 160. The usual lever pulled by the underworld to extort a contractor is to threaten the contractor with industrial disruption. Unless money is paid, a site will be closed, or an EBA will be refused, or a contract will be cancelled. 161. The Setka-era CFMEU supplied the underworld with the extortion lever. 162. And it was not just the underworld which used the model. The CFMEU was quite eager to engage in its own extortion. There are many stories of CFMEU officials demanding an outcome under the threat of industrial dispute. Several instances will be recounted in this report. 163. An example, toward the end of 2023, a smaller-scale subcontract for waterproofing was being let on the Northeast Link. Tenders were received, and as would be expected, there was a range, from $10 million to $14 million. That is when Joe Miles inserted himself into negotiations to tell the principal that it must select the highest quote or the rest of the job would be shut down. There was no choice. $4 million would be the money lost in a week-long delay. The grateful subcontractor gave the principal superintendent's bottle of Grange Hermitage. It is inconceivable that rewards were not given to the CFMEU officials involved. 164. The Victorian CFMEU was ambitious in its extortion demands. It did not limit its demands to Victoria. Here are 2 examples. 165. One large contractor, Handful, had substantial businesses in both Victoria and NSW. In NSW, the company was working under AWU agreements. 166. Another large contractor, Broughton, was executing a complex contract on the Glen Huntley site. Large precast beams had to be transported at night along Darramount Road. Special cranes had been brought in for the erection. The job was to run for 2 to 3 weeks. Every day was very expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars. 167, 168, 169, the Gatto extortion model, 170. It seems fair to call what follows the Gatto extortion model because he is the leading exponent of it, but it would be wrong to think Gatto is the only person to use it. 171. The Gatto extortion model involved demanding money from contractors under the threat that unless a payment is made, the CFMEU would raise an industrial issue and close a building site. Extortion under the Gatto model was real, and the downsides were serious. Closing a building site for a day would cost the builder between $50,000 and $500,000, depending on the size and complexity of the job. An executive at a Tier 1 firm, threats and extortion, Burmese, said closing its sites for a day would cost the business $1 million. Obviously, a lengthy site closure could quickly drive some builders into bankruptcy. 178. In March 2025, as part of Operation Rye, the Australian Federal Police executed search warrants at the home and office of Charles Pellegrino. Information has emerged that many contractors have made payments to accounts owned or controlled by Pellegrino. The contractors include Cobalt Constructions, Glenkew Broadbeach, Rangedale Drainage Services, Cobuild Construction, Threats and Extortion, 179. There is no way that this is a complete list. They are just the names which have come to this investigation. There are several other companies which are known to have made payments. 180. Some of these businesses are victims and pay unwillingly. Others are not. There are several businesses which saw the advantage of Gatto's support and happily paid him to buy that advantage. For example, one of the companies on the list was adamantly opposed to taking out a CFMEU EBA, so it paid Gatto to smooth the way with the CFMEU. This worked nicely for the firm and also for Gatto. It is unlikely that the CFMEU officials went unrewarded. Some 281. Some people continue to make payments because of fear for their own safety. Gatto will not be embarrassed by this appearing in this report. He does not want this kept a secret. It is part of his business model that he would like it known that if you stop paying Mick Gatto, there will be consequences. 182. Gatto's terror campaign worked. How big is this extortion racket? 186. It is difficult to assess exactly how much money passed through the system as a result of this kind of extortion, but we do have a little insight into the size of Gatto's share of this racket. It seems that retainer payments to Gatto are in the range of. Gatto has recently said that there are 5 builders paying him this kind of retainer. 30. That seems a gross underestimate given the number of companies uncovered by the Australian Federal Police. The real figure seems to be more in the order of 15 or more builders paying this retainer. 187. So Gatto would be making well over $5 million each year from this racket alone. Given that most of it is taking place on big build jobs, eventually it is the taxpayer who is paying for this kind of extortion. Systemic corruption. 188. There were 2 distinct types of corruption which afflicted Setka's CFMEU. One was a kind of institutionalized or systemic corruption, common practices which were developed, approved, and delivered by the power elite which controlled the union. The other was ad hoc corruption, mainly driven by individuals working their own scams on their own terms. 189. As described earlier in this report, before the administration there was a small group of power brokers who effectively controlled the Victorian CFMEU. This small group made all of the important decisions. They did so with little or no regard for the union rules and in the absence of external scrutiny. Some of the decisions made by those power brokers can now easily be seen as corrupt decisions. For example, they took control over enterprise bargaining in a way which made it corruptible, then enjoyed the fruits. The way in which they took control over the emerging labor hire industry is another prime example of how an existing system had been manipulated. 191. There were many organized or systemic abuses inflicted by this power broker group. Some were large, none were small. Here, just a few examples will be given. The introduction of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. 192. Somebody brought the Bikies into the ordinary operations of the CFMEU. Some witnesses said it was Joe Miles, others blamed Elias Spernovasilis. There were other theories too. 193. But it does not really matter. Other members of the controlling group did nothing to stop, remove, or control the Bikies. All are complicit. 194. What is known is that the Bikies infested the CFMEU and took control over parts of its operations. 195. This is such an important part of the whole problem with the Setka-era CFMEU that this subject is given its own section. Manipulating the enterprise bargaining system. 196. There are many flaws in the enterprise bargaining system. The system plainly requires an overhaul. One problem is that the system reposes too much trust in the participants. The assumption underpinning enterprise bargaining is that the negotiations are fair and honest. The assumption is wrong. 197%. The former power brokers in the CFMEU ruthlessly took advantage of the union's privileged role in the enterprise bargaining system. The gaps in the current system allowed the CFMEU to enhance its power, control the market, and to effect corrupt schemes for their benefit, for their friends' benefit, and to punish perceived opponents. 198. This is factually complex and sufficiently serious to warrant its own section in the report. Manipulating the rise of labor hire. 199. The CFMEU should be militantly opposed to the overuse of labor hire. It destabilizes the workforce, creates financial uncertainty, and can operate to deny workers their entitlements. 200. The rise of labor hire in the building sector has been like a slow rising tide, gradual and unstoppable. 201. There were some in the CFMEU who recognized that this presented an opportunity. Given the CFMEU had a near monopoly over who could get a labor hire EBA, it was recognized that this gave great leverage to those who allocated those EBAs. 202. Corruption was made easier because of the greed of the entrepreneurs seeking entry into the labor hire industry. The labor hire sector of the Victorian building industry has emerged as the single most corrupt part of that industry. Most major players in labor hire have paid bribes to obtain their position. Payments were then continued to protect their position. Because it is so very lucrative, it has attracted the interest of the worst kinds of criminals. 203. The labor hire problem is so bad it also needs its own section. The appointment of unwanted and unnecessary delegates. 204. This subject is central to understanding the flagrant misuse of power by the former CFMEU leadership. It is a prime example of how the Victorian leadership favored outsiders over its own general members. 205. Some background regarding delegates is necessary. Union delegates are critical players in the building industry. They stand in protection of the workers. They identify and expose abuses by the employers. They protect members' rights. They are responsible for the workers' health and safety. Delegates are essential. 206. The point needs to be made that most delegates are good people, experienced and trusted, not just by members but also by bosses. This section of the report is not. About those good delegates, this section of the report is about a smaller subset of delegates introduced by the power brokers of Setka's CFMEU. Not just family and friends, but criminals, drug dealers, and bikies. These misfits make up only a small proportion of the CFMEU's delegates, but they were unusually powerful, and their numbers, at least before the administration commenced, were growing. 207. The power brokers within the Victorian CFMEU repeatedly abused their power and influence by appointing outsiders to cushy, well-paid positions as delegates or as health and safety representatives. These were not real delegates, these were fake delegates. Often fake delegates were appointed over the objection of the contractor. Often the appointee was unsuited to the job. Often the appointment was made at the cost of a deserving member of the general membership getting the job. Often the appointment was made contrary to the CFMEU rules. 208. These fake delegates were not long-standing members interested in industrial issues. A battle-weary contractor, Homage, who had been forced to employ fake delegates, explained, "The HSRs they make us take are not trained, they are not interested, and they do not turn up." 209. This would have made the job unprofitable, so persuasion had no choice but to capitulate. 210. A more dramatic example comes from the experience of Commodore, an executive with substantial contractor, Santiago. 211. 213. The conditions under which these delegates and HSRs were employed were very favorable. The positions paid more than $200,000 a year, sometimes more than $300,000 a year. They were often given a car. They were paid at higher award rates, at CW3 or higher, even though they were unskilled. These delegates did no physical work. Because they were not doing physical work, the delegates did not even need to go to site. If they did go to site, the delegates were given a spot in an air-conditioned office with access to Foxtel and betting channels. 214. The excuse repeatedly made by the union, especially by John Setka, is that the CFMEU must take control over the selection of delegates and HSRs to ensure the safety of the workers on site. In relation to the majority of the good delegates, that statement is true. In relation to the fake delegates, it is laughably false. The types of people who were forced onto unwilling contractors were not only unskilled and untrained, but had personal histories and abuse problems which made them highly unsuited and undesirable for appointment. Those appointed included dangerous criminals, killers, drug dealers, and violent bikies. Their presence made the sites less safe. 215. This abuse of power was continuing until recently. There is an especially appalling example of the appointment of a health and safety representative in early 2025. Shortly after his appointment, the HSR, Muhammed Sayan, was arrested for murder. 216. Before going further, it is appropriate to ask the obvious question, why did the contractors acquiesce? The answer to that is obvious. A failure to employ the fake delegate would result in damage to the business or worse. One case study traces what happened to a contractor when he refused to employ a senior bikie at the direction of former organizer Joel Shackleton. The leadership knew this was wrong. Appointing fake delegates and fake HSRs was unlawful, and the CFMEU leadership knew it. 218. In a statement issued back in 2016, the CFMEU leadership was boasting that delegates were elected, delegates are elected by rank-and-file members. 221. The CFMEU has been caught out for this kind of conduct previously. 219. That should be the case. It is contrary to the rules for an official to appoint a delegate, they must be elected or otherwise appointed by the Divisional Branch Management Committee. It is contrary to law for an official to require a contractor to employ an outsider to the union as a delegate. 220. Yet this is precisely what the Setka-era CFMEU was doing. This was unlawful conduct and a straightforward breach of S-355 of the Fair Work Act 2009. 222. In 2015, the CFMEU and its president, Ralph Edwards, were heavily fined under S-355 of the Fair Work Act for very similar conduct. Edwards had insisted a contractor employ a particular person as a delegate. When the employer refused, Edwards threatened industrial action and to blackball the contractor to prevent it from winning other contracts. 223. A case study in the Trade Union Royal Commission resulted in findings adverse to John Setka for insisting a contractor employ 2 unwanted delegates. Setka was referred for prosecution under S-355 of the Fair Work Act. 37. The economic cost of unnecessary delegates. 224. The cost of forcing fake delegates onto contractors was enormous. Contractors were being required to employ unnecessary workers. Often the amount that unnecessary worker was being paid made the difference between profit and loss. Some businesses were literally forced into liquidation. Others went out of business because the profits were insufficient to warrant the business continuing. 225. The reason this was occurring was because the sums being paid to the fake delegates were enormous. Examples are given below of unqualified laborers receiving an average of $6,000 a week or more. 226. On top of this, the fake delegates did little or no work, and yet they earned more than the real workers. 227. Even though the persons pushed forward by the CFMEU for these positions usually had no skills nor experience, they were paid at higher rates applicable to skilled workers. Some of the CFMEU's delegates demanded to be paid for 56 hours per week, irrespective of how much they actually worked. 228. As an example, 230. The benefits flowing to fake delegates do not stop with high rates of pay. Contractors were often required to provide a car or a fuel card to these fake delegates, and this was on top of already generous travel allowances. 231. An even more disturbing feature is that many delegates put in place by the Setka CFMEU were often paid twice, once by the contractor directed to employ them, and again by a labor hire company listing their name on its books. This is the notorious ghost shift. Those names were then part of an invoice submitted by the labor hire companies to contractors and eventually paid by the Victorian taxpayers. The appointment of friends and family to lucrative jobs. 232. This is a subset of the abuse of power impacting the general membership. The former power brokers running the union used their influence to have family and friends employed on highly lucrative work, or given soft jobs, or even given jobs where they did not need to turn up. 233. This was a common practice backed by threats. There was no delicacy or shame about it. In one instance, the former Assistant Secretary Derek Christopher pressured a builder, Hoc Corruption, to employ a delegate, Frank Perkovic. Perkovic was Christopher's father-in-law. 234. A spectacular example of this kind of abuse can be seen from the especially troubled Hurstbridge rail upgrade. It needs to be emphasized that this is one example selected from many. The same was happening on many, maybe all of the sites around Melbourne. 235. Hurstbridge was a project conducted under the Southern Project Alliance. 236. The project was large and the work intensive. One estimate is that there were 540 working on the day shift and roughly the same on the night shift. 237. Work on the Hurstbridge sites were amongst the most lucrative for CFMEU members. Site work hours were extended. The day shift commenced at 5 a.m. to avoid clogging traffic and to permit ordinary commuter use of the station. There was a lot of night and weekend work. The unusual hours, night shifts, and weekend work attracted higher hourly rates of pay. 238. In addition, there were special events where a section of the railway had to close to permit work. A closure like this is known as a rail occupation, indicating that the contractors had assumed occupation of that section of the railway. To those involved in it, a rail occupation was known as an Occo, because it would disrupt commuter transport. An Occo would normally occur at night, on a weekend, or over a holiday period. Double time or even triple time was common. When working on an Occo, a worker could be paid $5,000 to $10,000 for a weekend. Occasionally, it was even more. 239. All of this gave another opportunity to a person with authority to wield power and act corruptly for their own benefit. There were several accounts given that former CFMEU organizers and delegates were actually charging a fee to people who wished to work in Occo, because there was so much money to be earned. The fees charged by the delegates or the others were sums like $500 or even $1,000. 240. Even the labor hire companies were charging their own employees to be employed by them. 241. It gets worse. When they became aware that an Occo was scheduled, CFMEU organizers and delegates would speak to friends and relatives who encouraged them to apply to work on the Occo. A list of names would be compiled. That list would then be thrust onto the builder, and the builder would be told that these people would need to be employed if the Occo was going to proceed smoothly. 242, 243, 244. The builders were never in a position to say no to a request like this. If there was ever any delay at all to an Occo, builders were subject to massive liquidated damages. The CFMEU was holding a gun to the head of the builders. 245. The story here is not about money. It is about the mindset of the former CFMEU officials who seized on any opportunity to manipulate or corrupt. It is about the mindset of the CFMEU power elite who thought it was their prerogative to allocate benefits to their friends in preference to the general membership. The Building Industry 2000 Slush Fund. 246. There is an organization named Building Industry 2000. It has about $1 million in assets. The two directors and shareholders are John Setka and the former president, Ralph Edwards. Its accounts are rarely audited and only produced sporadically. One official said there are not many records at all. 247. The origins and role of Building Industry 2000 remain murky. 214. The then Secretary Bill Oliver said it had been set up to help pay for CFMEU officials to stand for government and unions elections. At other times, it has been said it was set up to help workers in need or to donate to charities. To help workers in 48. Oliver at Building Industry 2000 is also obscure. Oliver explained it was by conducting the famous CFMEU AFL Grand Final Breakfast, CFMEU Golf Days, and Race Days. It also takes a slice of up to 20% from the vending machines on CFMEU sites. 249. As for the purpose to which the fund will be put, Oliver's version is more likely to be true. Using a union's money to fund candidates in a union election is illegal. Oliver noted this and explained that this was why Building Industry 2000 was set up. He said it is totally separate to the CFMEU, and this meant those who controlled the fund could spend the money on union elections without disobeying the law. 250. So, as matters stand, there is a fund of $1 million comprised of money mainly received from CFMEU members, which lies under the complete control of John Setka and Ralph Edwards, the signatories of the bank accounts. It seems they are free to use that money as they wish. 251. In April 2025, without notice to the membership or the administrator, the address for Building Industry 2000 was moved to Ralph Edwards' home address. 252. When the administrator asked for details regarding the fund, Setka responded with the deranged rant set out in the introduction to this report. Edwards did not respond at all. 253. The probability is that this fund will be used as an election war chest, used to benefit select members of the former power elite, used to defeat those who would oppose Setka and his group. 254. The point can be made that none of this is out of character. The power elite has felt they had a free hand to distribute money to pay for the election of favored persons to all kinds of positions. 255. For example, the CFMEU used $195,000 of members' money to support a political campaign for Elizabeth Doidge for election to Melbourne City Council. It is not immediately apparent how that could be in the interests of the general membership. Systemic corruption. The Doidge was, after all, the domestic partner of Joe Miles. 256. And there is a matter currently before the federal court where the general manager of the Fair Work Commission is seeking answers from the decision makers as to why they spent in excess of $300,000 supporting the re-election of Diana Asmar as the Secretary of the Health Services Union. The allegations include an assertion that the former power brokers in the CFMEU went to efforts to conceal or withhold information relating to the gift. 257. Notably, the HSU has been placed into administration and Asmar removed following corruption allegations. Ad hoc corruption. 258. The expression ad hoc corruption is being used here to describe the myriad of ways in which former CFMU officials sought to use their power to solicit some kind of benefit in return for favorable treatment, or a contractor seeks an advantage by offering to provide an official with a benefit. Sometimes it will involve cash, often it involves some other kind of tangible benefit. The ways in which this kind of corruption occurred, and the ways in which this corruption was rewarded, are only limited by the imagination of the parties to the corruption. 259. The use of the expression ad hoc is not meant to suggest the sums at stake are small. A case study will be presented where it appears that one former CFMEU official received massive benefits over a prolonged period. As will be seen, millions of dollars can be involved. 260. One type of ad hoc corruption was bribery. It seems bribery was an acceptable, unexceptional, everyday feature in the work of CFMEU officials. John Setka admitted to being offered hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes during an interview. The conversation continued. Mitchell, did you tell the police? Setka, no. Mitchell, it's illegal. Setka, a lot of things are illegal. Driving here, I've probably done 63 Ks in the 60K zone. That was illegal. 43. 261. Equating hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes with a minor driving transgression gives an insight into the mind of those who formerly ran the CFMU. Bribes, even large bribes, were just part of the way the CFMU worked. 262. Another type of ad hoc corruption came through those little advantages which builders were willing to give, and former officials were very willing to take. It happened all the time. But, according to the CFMEU, they had to take the benefits as they were left without a choice. One witness described being present at a national executive meeting when the National Secretary, Michael O'Connor, proposed the introduction of a transparency reform. The former Assistant Secretary Elias Spernovasilis strongly opposed it on the basis, you don't know the sort of people we have to deal with. We can't knock back the people who give us stuff. These are two pathetic but effective examples of this cupidity. First, for years the experienced former organizer Steve Long used his position to extract donations from contractors to keep his beloved Port Melbourne Football Club alive. Long's requests were underwritten by an implicit threat that if the donation was not made, the contractor's work would become difficult. Second, a guest at John Setka's home noticed that all of the high-quality fittings, tiling, and finishes in Setka's newly renovated bathroom were precisely the same as those being used in a ritzy apartment development recently worked on by CFMEU members. 46. 264. This kind of ad hoc corruption has always been present in the building sector. It is not new, and it is not endemic to Victoria. In 2019, the president of the Queensland branch of the CFMU, Dave Hanna, was sentenced to 2 years in jail for corruption after receiving about $150,000 in home renovations from Mirvac. More recently, the former secretary of the NSW branch, Darren Greenfield, was jailed after pleading guilty to taking bribes from a contractor. The contractor had said that he paid the bribes because he understood that was how you got work through the CFMEU. Examples of ad hoc corruption. 265. There are all kinds of things that contractors will do, invited and uninvited, to buy favors from union officials. There were all kinds of benefits which union officials took from contractors, apparently treating it as some kind of adjunct which came with the office. 266. These are just a few examples of CFMU officials engaging in ad hoc corruption. There are many, many more examples that could be given. Some are comparatively small, some are very substantial. John Setka's curious real estate interests. 267. It is difficult to get a real feel for the full extent of John Setka's property portfolio, his real estate transactions, and his property developments. 268. The reason it is difficult is that Setka has taken measures deliberately to conceal his interests. 269. Setka seems to own at least 4 houses, some say more. It is not clear how a man on his salary, fully devoted to union duties, could have done so well. 270. In addition, from the little which has surfaced, his financing arrangements constitute an undisclosed conflict of interest, his property development involves questionable conduct, and the persons with whom Setka has been dealing include the worst kind of criminals. 271. It is beyond the powers of this investigation to examine this issue satisfactorily. That would require coercive powers. But a few details have been able to be obtained in respect of a couple of Setka's transactions. What follows are 3 instances which raise troubling implications. Each warrants deeper investigation. John Setka and Dream Street. 272. John Setka has been an adamant and persistent promoter of Dream Street lending to the general CFMEU membership. 273. It was almost like Setka was doing paid advertisements for Dream Street, constantly pushing members to look into using only a single financier in the wide commercial market. 274. This is puzzling. A trade union leader would not usually repeatedly speak to the membership about finance. It is not an anticipated role. Setka has no skills or training to give financial advice, but Setka was urging Dream Street onto his membership. One might wonder what was in it for him. 275. The fact is that while he was heavily promoting Dream Street, Setka was also financing his own property transactions, including his property development business, through Dream Street. There was also a close connection between Setka and John Hronis, the owner of Dream Street. 47. 276. It appears that Setka failed to disclose to the general membership that he was getting his financing from Dream Street, or that he was a close personal friend of the owner of the business he was promoting. 277. Ordinarily, to discharge a conflict of interest of this kind would require disclosure of Setka's full suite of financial relations with Dream Street. Setka has never revealed anything about it. That raises questions. 278. For example, there is no evidence of the terms of the arrangements in place between Setka and Dream Street. Perhaps, if Setka's relationship with Dream Street had been disclosed, union members may have asked Setka if he was receiving favorable terms in return for his support for Dream Street. Maybe that could have answered another persistent rumor that Dream Street was either paying or forgiving Setka's mortgage repayments. 279. And this is not the only transaction where Setka and Hronis' interests appear to have intersected. Both Setka and Hronis purchased townhouses at a similar point in time in a property development in Dromana Parade in Safety Beach. Perhaps by itself there is nothing odd about that, except that there is a cloud over the developer of the property. John Setka, Jadran Delic, and Horty Mokbel. 280. Jadran Adrian Delic is a close friend of Setka, probably a business partner of Setka, and a connected underworld figure. 281. Delic's son-in-law is Rocco Arico, a notorious crime figure. Delic and his family share financial arrangements with members of the Mokbel family. In particular, Delic seems to be a business partner of Horty Mokbel. That is problematic, as Mokbel, apart from his prominent role in the Mokbel crime gang, is a drug trafficker, a money launderer, and a violent man. Figure 7. Jadran Adrian Delic. 282. Delic and Mokbel develop properties together. One development is in Safety Beach, the same suburb Setka and John Hronis of Dream Street bought their beachside properties. It is unclear who developed the properties purchased by Setka and Hronis. 283. Even that is not an end to the curiosities which are thrown up by these transactions. 284. On the same day in 2011, 2 companies were incorporated. One company was Dalmatia Pty Ltd, the other was Dalmatia Investments Pty Limited. The companies shared the same registered office. It is clear that the 2 companies are related. The original director of Dalmatia Pty Ltd was Jadran Delic, but he was later joined by the convicted drug trafficker Sean Gorlitz. Delic and Gorlitz have other businesses together. 285. The sole director of Dalmatia Investments Pty Ltd was David Setka. 286. The only reasonable inference is that John Setka had intended to create some kind of business in conjunction with 2 infamous criminals, using his 21-year-old son as a frontman. 287. It would be interesting to ask Setka what he had in mind for the future of his Dalmatia project, but, of course, he refused to assist. John Setka, the property developer. 288. John Setka has conducted his own property developments. 289. It is an obvious area of a potential conflict of interest if the head of a building union, who speaks in fiery terms about contractors, has his own commercial relationships with those same contractors. 290. Yet there is no evidence that Setka disclosed to the general membership or to the other members of the executive that he was conducting his own property developments. 291. At the very least, Setka's arrangements needed to be disclosed. They were not disclosed. In fact, they were concealed. 292. But the potential for a conflict of interest is not the only concern regarding Setka's property development business. Setka commenced a property development in relation to a property in Sedan. He did not use his own name, he used a corporate vehicle. Pursuit Developments Pty Limited. There is, of course, nothing wrong with that, except that he concealed his own involvement in the company by putting it in the name of his son, David Setka. At the time the property in Sedan was purchased, David Setka was aged 18. 294. David Setka's ownership of the company was acknowledged to be a sham in emails. John Hronis of Dream Street provided the finance, and he was aware of the sham because the emails were sent to him. 295. Setka's development of the property at Sedan is under a cloud because numerous informants suggested that Setka had received labor and materials either for free or on the cheap from building contractors. These were building contractors, which were regularly doing deals with the CFMEU. 296. Setka's partner in the Sedan property development was Frank Perkovic. Perkovic is a longtime close ally of Setka, the father-in-law of Derek Christopher and a CFMEU delegate. Setka arranged for Perkovic to get a cushy appointment as a delegate. It was notorious that Perkovic was not attending to his duties as a delegate because he was, more or less, fully engaged in superintending the property development in Sedan. John Perkovic's real estate transactions. 297. In December 2017, a senior CFMEU organizer, John Perkovic, bought the front block of a larger block in a typical battle axe format. Figure 8, John Perkovic in full flight. 298. That standard real estate deal led to two highly questionable transactions. One relates to the construction of a new house on the front block, the other relates to Perkovic's subsequent acquisition of the back block. The full story is set out in a case study. 299. An old house on the front block was demolished in August 2019, and work to build a new house commenced soon after. The builder was Macon Building, a business owned by Tony Jurek. Jurek is a contractor with other business interests upon which Perkovic could confer benefits. Several sources suggested that Perkovic regularly supported Jurek's businesses by recommending it to contractors. For example, there is evidence that Perkovic had involvement in one of Jurek's businesses being awarded an EBA. 300. Perkovic should never have entered arrangements with Jurek, at least without declaring them. 301. The details of the arrangements between Perkovic and Jurek are quite unsatisfactory. Perkovic was unable to say how much the building works cost, was unable to say if the contract was in writing, was unable to say whether the job was for a fixed price or for costs plus, and was uncertain as to how the building works were financed. 302. Jurek failed to return calls. 303. The circumstances surrounding the acquisition of the back block defy innocent explanation. 304. In June 2020, the back block was purchased by GSN Projects Pty Ltd, a company owned by George Nestorovsky. Nestorovsky was another contractor with businesses that could be, and according to sources were, benefited through Perkovic. 305. Aerial photography shows that soon after the purchase, Perkovic and his builder Jurek began to use the back block as though it was common property. 306. In March 2024, Nestorovsky sold the back block to Perkovic. There was no agent involved and no sale campaign. The conveyancing documents suggest no money changed hands and Perkovic acquired the back block for free. The property has no mortgage on it. Derek Christopher's home renovations. 307. This issue has been around for years. An allegation that the former Assistant Secretary Derek Christopher had valuable renovations carried out at his home for no charge by grateful or hopeful contractors. Figure 9. Derek Christopher. 308. Christopher would say with some force that although he was arrested, he was never charged. But that has never been the real test as to whether something happened or not. There is ample evidence that Christopher did receive an illicit benefit. The decision not to prosecute could be for some reason which does not go to whether or not the benefit was conferred. 309. Christopher was an assistant secretary of the CFMEU and was very powerful. Setka had anointed Christopher as his successor. His father-in-law, Frank Perkovic, was a CFMEU stalwart, a delegate, and a close friend and union ally of John Setka. Christopher's wife was employed by the CFMEU. Christopher was in a strong position to confer benefits and inflict trouble on major contractors. 310. In early 2017, Christopher purchased a modest house in Keilor Point and immediately set about renovating it. An anonymous tip-off came to the police from one of the workers on Christopher's job. The whistleblower worked for a major builder. He had been moved off his usual work and told to assist in the renovations. That worker was told that it was a favor for Christopher. 311. The police became interested and installed surveillance cameras across the street. The video showed the workers on site and the materials being delivered. The job proceeded unusually quickly. Neighbors described how 20 men could be working on the job on any day. 312. The building companies involved in the work were large operators, Built, ProBuild, and even Multiplex, companies which never undertake domestic work. 313. The job was substantial, but the precise cost remains uncertain. Surprisingly, Christopher did not know an estimated $350,000. It seems likely to have been substantially more than that. 314. Early one morning, police arrived with warrants, entered the property, and seized papers and electronic devices. 315. Christopher provided some excuses, but they were very lame. He recounted how busy builders just happened to be traveling past the site and noticed materials were being delivered, so they stopped to help out, that sort of thing. His account was not at all believable. 316. But the police charges never arrived. There is a rumor that there was a defect in the collection of the evidence which probably made it inadmissible in a criminal court. 5 years after the raid, it looks as though charges will never be laid. 317. Except, there is a witness. 320. It was shortly after this, Christopher was able to produce a number of receipts for the purchase of materials and the supply of labor. John Perkovic Insurance. 321. In July 2023, Perkovic was moving into a brand new home. He arranged his insurance through a broker who, on July 30th, 2023, sent an email to Perkovic attaching the policy details and an invoice. The cost of the policy was just over $4,200. In the covering email, which was copied to Steve at tapuplabor.com.au, there is this reference. Hi John, Steve has been kind enough to cover your insurance policy this year with Chubb Insurance. 322. It was obvious that Steve Melek, the owner of Top Up Labor, was paying this insurance premium as some kind of benefit to Perkovic, but Perkovic was unwilling to admit this. He claimed not to know anything about the matter and even refused to admit that the Steve referred to in the email was Melek. He appeared to be saying that it could be someone else named Steve, but when asked to nominate another Steve, he could not do so. John Perkovic's cars. 323. The three members of the Perkovic family have 4 cars between them, but probably did not pay for any of them. Probably did not pay for any of work vehicle. That can be put to one side. Another is a valuable vintage Falcon GT, which, although he drives it, Perkovic says he is only storing for his friend Steve Melek. The Falcon GT is worth over $100,000. 325. Another car is driven by his wife, a 2025 Range Rover worth over $100,000. But Perkovic says that this is just on loan from his friend George Nestorovsky. 326. The fourth car is driven by Perkovic's daughter, a BMW that cost $48,000. When asked how he financed the purchase, Perkovic claimed it was a loan from his friend Nick Lee, but the details surrounding the loan are laughably inadequate. 327. The problem with this is that each of Melek, Nestorovsky, and Lee control contracting companies which Perkovic was until his sacking in a position to benefit. 328. The full details relating to this are contained in a case study. 52. Joe Miles' wedding. 329. In April 2022, Joe Miles and his partner hosted a group of around 24 at a lavish pre-wedding party at a resort, Casa Angelina, in Mexico. The guests were each staying in suites. The couple are said to have then flown to Las Vegas where the actual wedding took place. 330. It is uncomfortable to report on this because what follows barely arises above rumor, but it is a rumor which was raised and repeated time after time from a number of different sources. Joe Miles specifically denies the rumor and says LL costs were paid for my wife and I. But the rumor is persistent, and if true, it involves serious corruption. 331. The rumor is that the event in Mexico was partly or wholly funded by contractors. According to these same sources, the principal funder was BK Labor, a labor hire firm with which Miles had a very close relationship. There was reliable information that Miles was persistently promoting BK Labor to contractors, that is, promoting in the sense of directing contractors to use BK Labor, or they would suffer industrial action. There is a very strong rumor that, after he was removed from his position in the union, Miles went to work for BK Labor. 332. The sole owner of BK Labor would have good reason to be grateful to Miles. In 2024, BK Labor had a turnover of $270 million. If it achieved profit margins like those of other labor hire businesses, it was an annual profit in the order of $25 million. 333. But for now, all this remains a rumor. The reason that this remains a rumor is because it became impossible to get any information from those with first-hand knowledge. 334. It is known that the event occurred because some of the guests posted photographs and comments on social media. By the time this investigation commenced, those posts had been deleted. What is known is that there were contemporaneous accounts on Instagram suggesting that Miles and his partner were flying out all their friends to Mexico. It remains unknown as to who paid for the travel and accommodation expenses. 335. In an investigation like this, with very limited powers, it is not possible to get to the bottom of this issue. It would be a worthwhile topic for investigation by a body with full coercive powers. Mick Gatto's bracelets. 336. Mick Gatto made a gift of gold Versace bracelets to a select group of former CFMEU officials. It is not clear how much the bracelets were worth or even if they were real. 337. This rather pathetic story of Mick Gatto's bracelets is symptomatic of deeper institutional problems. Gatto's ownership of the former CFMEU leadership, the willingness of the former leadership to defer to Gatto, the former leadership's easy. 340. Comfort with corruption, the pure venality of those who took the gifts, i.e. taking whatever benefit is on offer. 338. Amongst those who received the bracelets were the following: John Setka, Secretary; Derek Christopher, Assistant Secretary; Joe Miles, Senior Vice President; Mick Miles, Junior Vice President; John Perkovic, Organizer 53; Frank Akbari, an organizer with special responsibilities for allocating EBAs; Paul Timas, Organizer; Andrew De Bono, Organizer; Paulo Jumara, Organizer. 339. This list is deliberately incomplete. Names have been omitted to protect against retribution, and there are solid stories that others amongst the former power brokers also received a bracelet. 341. The bracelets were delivered in small velvet bags. There are different stories as to how the bracelets were delivered. Some were handed over in person. John Perkovic has told others that his was delivered to his home. There is a story that shortly after Joe Miles got his bracelet, Gatto took it back because Miles had disappointed. Ad hoc corruption. Gatto on something. To the relief of all, after an apology, Miles got his bracelet back. 342. 343. It also seems unlikely that any of the other recipients would have worn the bracelet publicly. It would be the equivalent of displaying a cattle brand to tell the world that Gatto owns you. Outlaw motorcycle gangs. 344. The old executive steadfastly maintained that there was no untoward bikie influence within the CFMEU. The problem, they said, was imagined, not real. They even claimed that bikies were not overrepresented in their ranks. 345. In June 2016, the CFMEU dealt with the issue by issuing a formal statement. The CFMEU can confirm absolutely that no CFMEU official is a member of an OMCG. 346. These statements were false. Those who made the statements knew they were false. The truth is that bikies and OMCGs were massively overrepresented in the Victorian CFMEU under Setka's leadership. They held influential positions, and they even controlled some of the larger building sites. 347. And it was the old executive who brought the bikies into the CFMEU, the risk created by OMCGs. 348. There is probably no real need to provide data to prove bikies and OMCGs are dangerous. They are obviously dangerous. 349. A study from 2020 described OMCGs as part of organized crime in Australia. The study found members of OMCGs had high levels of involvement in methamphetamine production and distribution, illicit drug and firearm trafficking, tax evasion, money laundering, and serious violent crime. 56. 350. The rate of offending is astounding. Around Australia, there were just under 6,000 bikies who were members of 339 gangs. 1 in 4 had been prosecuted for violence and intimidation. 1 in 8 had been prosecuted for their involvement in organized crime. 351. Experience has shown that once bikies enter a field which presents criminal opportunities, they are almost impossible to eradicate. Bikies infiltrate the CFMEU. Under pressure from the attention created by the Building Bad newspaper series, action was taken by the old executive to remove some bikies as officials of the CFMEU. 353. It is unclear who initiated this. In any event, on July 30th, 2024, the former Victorian President Rob Grauman's wrote to the National Secretary Zach Smith, identifying 12 bikies who had held positions as a delegate or as a health and safety representative. There is no way the list is complete. For example, Luke Moloney is not mentioned. Figure 11. 354. Grauman's told Smith that action had been taken so that the bikies were no longer representatives of this branch. To give effect to this, Grauman said the bikies had either been reclassified as a worker on the tools, been stood down pending an investigation, or employed directly by their employer as an occupational health and safety officer. Why this discipline was necessary if the bikies presented no risk is left unexplained. 355. Those on Grauman's list were not ordinary bikies. They included senior bikies capable of issuing orders to other bikies within their gang. Because delegates and HSRs have considerable power over the selection of new employees on building sites, these bikies were in a position to favor the employment of their fellow gang members. Slowly, a site could become overrun by members of a particular OMCG. By putting bikies into positions of power, the CFMEU had ceded control over whole building sites to the bikies. 356. A case study will detail the history of some of the bikies listed by Grauman's, along with some others. Amongst the group were very violent criminals. Many in the group had convictions for drug dealing and drug use. Few had actual experience or qualifications in the building industry. It is impossible to understand how the CFMEU could have come, innocently, to support the appointment of men like these. They were being made representatives of the union. 357. The only reasonable explanation is that it was a deliberate measure. 358. Some of these men were promised their appointment while still in jail. In the case of Luke Moloney, it appears he received a promise of appointment just before he was to stand trial for a brutal bashing. Remarkably, several of these very violent bikies were given responsibility for the health and safety of other workers. 359. The appointment of these bikies was part of the old executive's practice of appointing friends to cushy, well-paid jobs. That practice is discussed in several case studies. Most or all of these bikies had been forced on reluctant or unwilling contractors with no interest in employing a bikie. 360. In any event, the action taken by Grauman's and the Victorian branch was nothing more than a sham. Even when stripped of their CFMEU credentials, the same bikies remained on the same sites, on the same pay, wielding the same power. It even looks as though one was never actually removed as a delegate. 361. This supposed action taken by Grauman's and the Victorian branch was merely an attempt to fend off criticism and an attempt to avoid or delay the appointment of an administrator. The struggle for control of Hurstbridge. 362. The OMCGs were using building sites as drug distribution points. 363. The story which follows will focus on a single site, the Hurstbridge rail upgrade. This site is not exceptional. What went on at Hurstbridge was also going on at other sites all around Melbourne. 364. Approximately 1,000 workers were on the Hurstbridge site. 540 on day shift, approximately the same on the night shift. That many workers, placed into a confined area, made Hurstbridge a desirable place from which to distribute drugs. And, because the rates of earnings at Hurstbridge were unusually high, it was also a desirable place to work. Those two factors meant that there were two struggles for control. One was between individual organizers and delegates at the CFMEU, the other was between rival bikie gangs. In some ways, the two are interrelated. 365. The original CFMEU organizers and site delegates on Hurstbridge included Paul Simas, Jimmy Vasilou, Andy Struthers, and a younger man named Laki. Struthers was a Comanchero or associated with the Comancheros. 366. In circumstances which the witnesses were unable to explain completely, some kind of internal dispute arose within the CFMEU. Most say it was due to a falling out between Simas and Joe Miles. When that happened, Miles tried to remove Simas and his delegates from positions on the Hurstbridge site. Miles then directed that the delegates Joel Levitt and Johnny Walker go to Hurstbridge. When Levitt and Walker arrived, they claimed that they were now the site delegates. Levitt is a member of the rebels. Walker was a convicted killer with a previous connection with the Bandidos. 367. Different witnesses recall seeing hostile verbal arguments between the two camps of CFMEU officials who claimed to control the site. One witness described it as a fight over money. Another witness described it as a hostile takeover. It was said to be especially heated between Andy Struthers and Joel Levitt. Keep in mind that Struthers was with the Comancheros and Levitt from the rebels. 368. Things became heated, but it still appeared to be an internal CFMEU fight. Then the Bikies got involved. 369. One day the Comancheros were called in. Several witnesses recounted what they saw that day. Some say they were called by Andy Struthers. Others say they were called in by Alex Stojakovic, a delegate employed by Sayan Engineering. Whoever made the call, the Comancheros collected in nearby Petrie Park. There were about 8 Comancheros who arrived in full colors, riding large and noisy motorcycles. The Comancheros continued their ride for the rest of the day, rolling in a continuous loop around the site and making it plain they were making a territorial demand. 370. One witness spoke about his knowledge that members of the rival rebels were also involved and that the gangs were staring each other down. 64-71. Why would rival bikie gangs attend a building site in this way? Several witnesses spoke of their knowledge that the real fight between the bikies was over which gang should be permitted to control drug distribution on and from the Hurstbridge site. 372. The issue between the bikies went away without violence. Whether it was settled with a truce or whether there was some agreement struck to share the site is not known. What is known is that the hostile takeover by Joe Miles, Joel Levitt, Johnny Walker, and the rebels was successful. Zimas and his group were driven from the site. Whether that has some connection with the resolution of the dispute between the Comancheros and the rebels remains a mystery. 373. There is, of course, a lot of speculation within the story just told. But within it, there are a number of features consistent with the idea that bikie gangs controlled drug distribution on these sites. 374. Several sources, including high-placed officials, have recounted that the working theory of the intelligence agencies is that the OMCGs use the building sites for drug distribution purposes. That theory is consistent, with OMCGs being the largest manufacturers and distributors of methamphetamines in Victoria. It is perfectly plausible that OMCGs would see a building site where 200 to 500 well-paid men aged between 18 and 35 were collected into a couple of hectares as an ideal venue for drug distribution. 375. There is a reason to suggest that senior officials in the CFMEU may have had some hand in facilitating the entry of the OMCGs. Members of OMCGs and men with outlaw motorcycle gangs. Convictions for drug dealing were forced onto contractors at Hurstbridge by CFMEU officials. That was unlikely to just be an unfortunate coincidence. Enterprise bargaining agreements. 376. In theory, the EBA system in the Victorian construction sector is fine. In practice, it is a disaster. The system has been thoroughly corrupted. Everything has gone wrong with it. Everything is slow and expensive. There is no bargaining. Template agreements are passed between the parties and left unread. The CFMEU is quite open about this. At one meeting, the former organizer Jerry McCrudden passed an EBA to an executive of a leading contracting company, Nutmeg, but when the executive raised possible negotiations, McCrudden was shocked, telling the executive, "There is no bargaining. No, nothing will be changed in this agreement." 378. And, as will be explained, the way in which the CFMEU controlled the EBA system was anti-competitive and economically damaging for Victoria. 379. Corruption was rampant. In practice, the EBA system provided an opportunity for powerful or well-connected individuals to make large sums of money. The way the system operates is unfair. The award of an EBA can confer a massive financial benefit on the recipient, especially in the areas of labor hire and traffic management. Meanwhile, the denial of a CFMEU-approved EBA can drive a decent contractor out of business. 380. A perfectly apt description of the CFMEU's approach to EBAs was given by the fixer Harry Corras when he was explaining to an undercover agent how he would facilitate the corrupt purchase of an EBA from the CFMEU bosses. Corras had this to say about those bosses. 381. They're very clever in how they do business, you know. and they don't give out EBAs that easy, and the reason why is because they control the market. The big build is theirs. You can't get in if you don't know someone. 65. 382. Chorus went on to explain how the CFMEU EBA system works. So, there's a fee to get an EBA. I think the upfront fee is cash, but all you've got to do, I told you, pay the boys, make sure they're okay, and that's it. That's business. 383. Chorus then went on to justify the corruption. Everybody gets to eat. 385. Because the CFMEU dominated the Victorian construction sector, the EBA system was effectively controlled by a group of powerful CFMEU officials. Being able to dictate when, how, and to whom an EBA was awarded conferred great power on a few members of the Setka-era CFMEU. Figure 12, Harry Chorus. Everybody gets to eat. Chorus is not just talking big. Everything he says about the CFMEU bosses and the EBA system is perfectly accurate. The Victorian EBA system had become old-fashioned pay-to-play corruption. No doubt there were many EBAs, which were many EBAs negotiated on merit, but many EBAs were the product of corruption. Under the CFMEU, EBAs were awarded in return for corrupt payments, or awarded to friends and denied to enemies. The beneficiaries of lucrative EBAs awarded by the CFMEU include known criminals. Bribery. 387. In an investigation of this kind, it is nearly impossible to expose instances of direct bribery. Naturally enough, neither the payer nor the recipient is likely to come forward. Finding evidence of bribery usually requires coercive powers to look at bank records, etc. 388. Fortunately, one person did come forward. This incident, by black market, buying and selling EBAs. 389. It is clear that under Setka's leadership, CFMEU EBAs were bought and sold as commodities on a kind of black market. 390. According to the black market, different types of EBAs had different values. Unsurprisingly, labor hire and traffic management EBAs were the most valuable. There were many accounts to suggest that a labor hire EBA will cost $500,000. There was one account where the asking price was $1 million. There was hard evidence that eager contractors paid $250,000 to obtain a civil construction EBA 67, and that $250,000 had been agreed for a demolition EBA. 391. We also know that, at least usually, the way the black market operated involved an arrangement made before the EBA was allocated. The corrupt businessman paid someone to have a new EBA drawn up and agreed. 392. The difficulty has been in getting witnesses to admit to their role in this. Many people have given accounts that they know of such arrangements, and a few have told their story about how they tried to do so but were unsuccessful. But it is real, and there are well-documented accounts of it occurring. The words of Harry Chorus quoted in the introduction to this section of the report make it clear that Setka-era CFMEU EBAs were up for sale. There's a fee to get an EBA. There is more about Chorus below. 393. One of the clearest examples of buying and selling EBAs has been the subject of a separate report. See the report Faruk Orman and ZK Infrastructure Pty Ltd, dated December 1st, 2024. There is a condensed version of that report included here as a case study. In that instance, Faruk Orman set up a company, got a civil construction EBA, and sold it for $250,000 a couple of days later. 394. There is also the account of Daniel Salter and how he paid to get an EBA, and the instance recounted by Atlanta, where the negotiations were advanced, but the deal. Report into Faruk Orman and ZK Civil Infrastructure, CFMEU website, December 1st, 2024. 69, ZK Study 13, Faruk Orman and ZK Infrastructure. C. Case Study 14, Billy Mitris, Elias, Spernovasilis, and X-Force Logistics, fell through 71. Each of those has its own case study. 395. So we know this was happening, but this investigation was incapable of getting closer to the detail of who in the former CFMEU leadership was facilitating this. We do not know just how often this was happening, or how much money was involved. We do not know how the corrupt proceeds were shared after the deals were finalized. 396. To get to the bottom of that would require an investigation supported with coercive powers. What appears in this report is merely evidence that there was a black market in respect of EBAs. Awarding EBAs to friends. 397. The Setka-era CFMEU did not only allocate EBAs on the basis of who paid the most to acquire them, they are also dished out to friends and family. 398. There are several examples of this and several different personalities who provide these favors. 399. John Setka is one who confers these favors. 400. In another, quite stunning decision, Setka has been behind awarding EBAs to companies controlled by Jadran Delik. This decision is stunning, not because Delik is a close friend of Setka, or because Delik is a well-known underworld figure. It is stunning because Delik is virulently anti-union and virulently anti-worker. In evidence in court, Delik admitted he hid his assets and explained it was because I'm in the building game and the way unions work at the moment, that any of your workers can sue you if they fall off or they hurt themselves, so they can sue you. 401. It is plain that Setka could not care less about the workers, including injured workers. 402. Elias Spernovasilis also conferred EBAs as favors. Spernovasilis is very close personally to the underworld figure, Billy Mitris. When Mitris said he wanted a specialist labor hire EBA for veterans, Spernovasilis got it for him within a short period. This was despite Spernovasilis knowing that Mitris was not an ex-serviceman. There is a case study giving the full details of this. 73, 403. It is quite clear that Mick Gatto received favorable treatment from the CFMEU. His many advantageous EBAs will be discussed throughout this report. What is of concern is the extent to which the CFMEU showed favoritism to certain persons just because they were friends and associates of Gatto. 404. For example, the notorious underworld figure, Faruk Orman, is very close to Gatto. When Orman was released from jail, he needed a new career. Even though Orman had no skills nor experience in the construction industry, he was quickly awarded an EBA for the specialist work of caulking and sealing. He received another for civil construction. EBAs were then awarded to a company in the name of Orman's wife in the lucrative traffic control area. 405. It seems all of the old CFMU executive were willing to bend the knee to Gatto. When Orman wanted a civil construction EBA, he was able, through an intervention by Joe Miles, to get one within days. Miles claimed not even to know Orman. If that is true, the only explanation for this favorable treatment is that Miles was doing a favor for Gatto. 75. 406. Another simple example demonstrates just how easily the EBA system was manipulated for the benefit of friends and friends of friends. Third-party EBA brokers. 408. When disappointed applicants were unable to obtain an EBA through merit, cronyism, or bribes, they were driven to buying EBAs through connected middlemen. A couple of these EBA brokers are especially prominent. These are just 3 of them. There are certain to be more. Billy Mitris. 409. A notable EBA broker is Billy Mitris, an underworld figure with connections to the drug dealer Rocco Arrico. 410. Mitris trades on his long-term, close personal connections with Elias Spernovasilis, a former assistant secretary at the CFMEU. It was a known fact that if an ambitious contractor was having trouble acquiring an EBA, an approach should be made through Mitris. 411. The story of Billy Mitris and X-Force Logistics is told in full in a case study. 77. Here it is enough to say that, when a hopeful contractor had spent months in fruitless negotiations with John Setka, Derek Christopher, and Elias Spernovasilis, he was advised to see Billy Mitris. After paying Mitris $10,000 and giving him a share of the business, the EBA was quickly approved. 412. When another contractor, Mexico, wanted a labor hire EBA, he was told his best chance was to approach Mitris. Harry Corus. 413. There is hard evidence that Harry Corus acted as a middleman, fixing crooked deals between contractors and the CFMEU. The hard evidence came from Corus's own mouth. 414. Some of those words were set out in the introductory part of this section of the report. The full text of what Corus said is set out in a case study. 7-8. Corus was unusually frank because he was unaware he was being duped. Corus simply thought he was just dealing with another corrupt businessman. 415. Part of Corus's business is to put third parties in contact with Mick Gatto. There is an example of this in a case study where a contractor who was willing to pay a bribe to get an EBA contacted Corus, but was surprised when instead it was Mick Gatto, with whom he negotiated. 416. The reputation of Harry Corus spreads wide. He has some kind of connection with providing corrupt indigenous EBAs. Faruk Orman. 419. The gangster Faruk Orman was another person able to intervene and secure CFMU EBAs for those willing to pay. 420. There is hard evidence that 2 businessmen paid Faruk Orman $250,000 to acquire civil infrastructure EBA. Once the corrupt contractors agreed to pay, Orman was able to get the EBA approved by the CFMU within a couple of days, excluding enemies from EBAs. 421. The CFMU had another practice of abusing its EBA power, punishing enemies by refusing EBAs. 422. This is a flip side to the corrupt granting of EBAs. The authority of the CFMEU to grant or refuse is absolute. No reasons needed to be given. There was no review. 423. In some instances, a refusal to grant an EBA can be the product of some personality clash or personal gripe. Reference was made above to the Marta Dandi incident. Sometimes, like the example about to be provided, it is because a contractor. 79 see case study 12, 81% see case study 13, Faruk Orman and ZK Infrastructure. Refuse the corrupt conditions attached to the EBA. Misuse and abuse of social procurement schemes. 424. All major government projects in Victoria are subject to the social procurement framework. 425. The framework is designed to encourage the use of contractors which pursue social enterprises or businesses employing those who otherwise face barriers to employment. The framework places particular emphasis on promoting Aboriginal businesses and businesses aimed at redressing gender imbalance. 426. No one could doubt the benefits to be derived if the framework is applied, but it is not being applied. It is being abused. 427. As will be detailed below, unscrupulous contractors have manipulated the purpose of social procurement, obtaining EBAs where they were unwarranted or where only lip service was paid to the social purpose. Often the contractors did not even qualify as a social procurement supplier. The CFMEU went along with this abuse or even encouraged it. 428. During the course of the investigation, very disturbing information was provided relating to a labor hire organization which specialized in finding employment for women. The information, which was from a variety of apparently reliable sources, was to the effect that before women could get a job, they had to offer sexual services to the proprietor. That man is no longer involved in the business, and, to its credit, the CFMEU assisted in getting rid of him. The allegations are so serious, it is not appropriate to provide further details without further investigation. 429. To simplify matters, this report will focus only on Aboriginal business EBAs, misuse and abuse of Aboriginal business EBAs. 430. According to Victoria's social procurement framework, an Aboriginal business is a business which is at least 51% Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait owned, or is otherwise certified by Kinaway or Supply Nation. 431. The potential for abuse is obvious. There are numerous instances where dummy 82 directors and shareholders have been installed to attempt to disguise the true ownership of a company, so-called black cladding. 432. Joel Shackleton was the head of the specialist indigenous group in the Setka-era CFMEU, known as Koori Constructions. Shackleton had unchecked power when awarding or refusing EBAs to Aboriginal businesses. 433. Shackleton was a very poor choice for someone in a responsible and powerful position. He is easily angered and prone to violence. 434. Shackleton abused his power. He obviously favored some contractors while destroying a string of businesses to which he denied indigenous EBAs. Examples of this are provided below. One has already been mentioned. The incident where Shackleton refused to grant an indigenous employer an EBA when the owner declined his demand to employ a notorious bikie. 435. What follows are just 3 examples of the problems created by the way in which the Setka-era CFMEU dealt with First Nations issues. Shackleton. 436. Below is a clear-cut way in which Joel Shackleton misused the wide powers that were given to him. 437. 438. 439. 440. 84. See Case Study 1. The Marta Dandi Incident. 443. Marta Dandi was a smaller-scale indigenous labor hire firm working in the civil space. It had an awu eba. Marta Dandi had a good business and a good reputation, but its business was drying up because of its inability to secure a CFMEU EBA. 444. For reasons which are unclear, Shackleton disliked the proprietors of Marta Dandi. He refused to support Marta Dandi's application for an EBA. That, given his power, was effectively a veto. 445. On March 16, 2022, there was an incident caught on video of a meeting between Shackleton, Jerry McCrudden, and the owners of Marta Dandi. The incident is disturbing for its violent language, but also for how it reveals the way in which Shackleton wielded his power. The incident is the subject of a case study. Marta Dandi 46. Marta Dandi never got its EBA and went into liquidation. Jera Resources Management 447. To show just how weak the recognition system is, Mick Gatto set up an indigenous labor hire business. Jera Resources Management Pty Limited. Jera Resources was recently placed into a voluntary liquidation, but it is still a story worth telling. 448. Jera Resources was a favored labor hire provider on several government projects. This was, no doubt, partly as a fulfillment of the social procurement framework designed to assist Aboriginal businesses and to encourage employment amongst First Nations peoples. 449. Except, Jera Resources was secretly owned by Gatto. 450. Although his name does not figure on the paperwork, it was common knowledge that Gatto owned Jera Resources. Jera Resources was described in the Victorian Parliament as a company with links to the underworld figure Mick Gatto, and as owned by Mick Gatto. 451. 452. Gatto. Resources to third parties. Labor hire. 453. In a hotly contested competition, labor hire is the single most corrupt aspect of the whole Victorian building sector. 454. There are 2 large issues here. The first is whether the widespread use of labor hire is appropriate at all. This is all part of the gig economy. There's been a movement away from the certainty of 5 or 6 days of direct employment to the uncertainty of 2 or 3 days of occasional labor engaged through labor hire suppliers. This has destabilized traditional working relationships, created confusion in the labor market, and eroded workers' entitlements to a range of benefits, notably superannuation. 455. While that first issue is a large and important matter, it is not the subject of the present investigation and report. Resolution of that issue lies with others, perhaps Parliament. 456. Rather, this investigation is directed at how the labor hire industry, fueled by the dramatic increase in the use of labor hire, has been corrupted, manipulated by outsiders, and during the Setka era became a funnel for money passing to criminal elements. 457. The CFMEU played a critical role both in the rise in the use of labor hire and also in its corruption. 458. The union's primary position should be to oppose labor hire. A right-minded union should be using its authority, as far as possible, to foster long-term direct employment of its members. Yet the CFMEU seemed almost to have encouraged the rise of labor hire. The rise in labor hire was accompanied by other opportunities for corruption and cronyism. It quickly became attractive to the power brokers in the CFMEU. Money, the root of the problem. 459. As stated above, labor hire has emerged as the single worst source of corruption in the Victorian building sector. 460. Why is labor hire especially corrupt? Because of the money to be made. 461. Labor hire on the big build generates over $1 billion per year. Based on information available from one of the larger labor hire businesses, before tax profit margin seems to be in order of 9%. For the sake of simplicity, that can be rounded to 10%. 462. Records have been cited relating to two of the larger labor hire organizations. 467. Those records suggest that MC Labor Services' total revenue was $270 million in 2023-2024, and annual profit in the order of $25 million. 90. Other records suggest that BK Labor Hire Pti Ltd had a turnover of $155 million in 2023-2024, and annual profit in the order of $15 million. Witnesses have said that another business, Top Up Labor, generates a turnover in excess of $70 million. 463. Those sums, and especially the profit margin, are extraordinary. BK Labor and Top Up Labor are owned by individuals. The business is, comparatively, risk-free. This is why several industry experts have described a labor hire EBA as a license to print money. How wide does the corruption spread? 464. In the course of this investigation, it has been disconcerting to see that so many of the labor hire suppliers are corrupt, how easily they get away with it, and how little is done to investigate and remove corrupt industry players. 465. Much of that comes through the systemic corruption of the EBA system, but there is also a great deal of ad hoc corruption. Individuals doing crooked deals to advance particular labor hire companies, or doing equally crooked deals to protect them from competition. 466. It is well known that particular previously employed officials were identified with assisting certain labor hire companies. John Setka and John Perkovic assisted Top Up Labor. Joe Miles assisted BK Labor. Steve Long promoted MC Labor and Argus Labor Hire. There is even a factional element. On construction sites, certain firms flourished. Meanwhile, on civil sites, other firms dominated. 468. A refreshing feature of the labor hire industry is that corruption is so rife there was no need to keep it a secret. Hence you have Harry Corra speaking so frankly about bribery to someone he had just met. And when a large labor hire business, Harbor, won a traffic management contract on the Eastern Freeway job, the owner, Salute, told his workforce that, "I've paid $800,000 to get this job, so don't stuff it up." 469. There are other reasons why labor hire has become such a large problem in terms of crime and corruption. 470. One derives from the CFMEU control over the allocation of EBAs. As Harry Corras explained, the CFMEU bosses don't give out EBAs that easy. The number of labor hire EBAs awarded at this time was surprisingly small for such an important part of the building sector. It is literally a billion-dollar industry. 471. The effect of these restrictions was to make labor hire businesses more profitable and labor hire EBAs more desirable. That, of course, encouraged corruption. 472. As seen from the previous section on the enterprise bargaining system, it is clear the power brokers within the CFMEU were selling EBAs. As the labor hire businesses became more and more profitable, corrupt contractors were willing to pay more and more to join in on the rort. And it meant that those already in the market became willing to do what was necessary to keep the market closed to newcomers. As Harry Corras put it, to put you there, they have to move someone. None of the current holders of EBAs wished to be moved. 473. The second reason labor hire is so problematic is because it's so profitable. The kinds of criminals moving into labor hire are very wealthy and very powerful. Labor hire has caught the eye of organized crime. Underworld figures, heroin traffickers, OMCGs, and money launderers have all moved into labor hire. 474. Perhaps all of this is why, in an investigation which has covered a lot of different types of corruption, labor hire stands out as the most crooked part of the building industry. Ghost shifts. 475. In May 2023, it was exposed that a multi-million-dollar fraud had been perpetrated by a labor hire company facilitating workers claiming for ghost shifts. 476. Ghost shifts are arrangements under which workers claim for shifts which they do not work. Sometimes workers will claim for 2 shifts at different sites at the one time. Numerous accounts were provided regarding workers signed in for a shift and immediately leaving the site. Some did not turn up at all and were signed in by friendly site supervisors. 477. When the scandal surfaced, the premier, Dan Andrews, stated that he had zero tolerance for ghosting. 478. The problem was, it happened again, and again, and again. 479. In early 2025, another ghost shift scandal broke. This it was suspected to have cost labor hire, the Metro Tunnel project, millions of dollars. It seems the scam may have been orchestrated by 2 CFMEU delegates. They were sacked. No one will tell me their names. 480. The labor hire firm involved in the scandal, MC Labor, claimed no knowledge of the scam. But MC Labor has a checkered history. 481. MC Labor had been the subject of an investigation when it was alleged that the firm had paid kickbacks to a CFMEU organizer, Danny Berardi. When the allegations broke, Berardi resigned from the union. 482. Apart from that, MC Labor has or had close connections with Toby Mitchell, one of Australia's most notorious bikies and criminals. He has survived 7 shootings. He is an irrational, violent criminal. He was a sergeant-at-arms in the Bandidos, then left them and then became a senior officer at the Mongols until he was thrown out for running with dogs. 483. Matt Lunaday is the operations manager at MC Labor. While he was in jail for aggravated burglary and theft charges, Lunaday formed a bond with Toby Mitchell, and Mitchell came to MC Labor to recruit workers. The workers recruited by Mitchell had a violent set of skills. 484. Despite this, MC Labor received heavy support from the CFMEU during the Setka era, and, in the Victorian Parliament, was said to have a near monopoly over labor hire in the Metro Tunnel. 485. And the truth is that MC Labor was not the only labor hire company charging for ghost workers on government projects. Others were at it as well. Organized crime. 486. Given it is probably the most important issue to be addressed in this report, it might be reasonable to ask, why has the subject of organized crime been left until last? 487. It is because, to understand organized crime in the Victorian building sector, requires an understanding of the various ways in which the CFMEU allowed this to happen. 488. Each of the types of corruption identified earlier in this report had the capacity to open the way for the entry of organized crime into the building sector. Think about the ability to use threats of industrial action to facilitate extortion, or the CFMEU's monopoly over the granting of EBAs. Add to that the union's ability to appoint favorites to overpaid and cushy jobs. 489. Meanwhile, there was a fierce unwillingness by the CFMEU to cooperate with the police. Gangsters knew that when dealing with the CFMEU, they were protected by an Australian-style omerta. 91. 490. It is easy to see why the CFMEU was attractive to organized crime. It is more difficult to understand why a trade union would give way to organized crime. It is not as though it is in the interests of the general union membership. 491. Again, the problem in the CFMEU started with its leadership. 492. The base outlaw mentality of some members of the old executive and their contempt for the law made them amenable to the underworld. The CFMEU office doors were always open to crime figures. Union administrative staff were available to assist gangsters. No one stopped it. 493. Some connections were personal and well-entrenched. Earlier in this report, mention was made that John Setka was personally connected with leading organized crime figures. This went well beyond mere friendships and extended to actual business partnerships. 92. 494. There were others who were just weak and allowed themselves to be corrupted. This was a kind of corporate weakness in the CFMEU. No one would rebuke Setka. No one would stand up to Joe Miles. There was a general willingness to bend rules. There was a general willingness to take benefits, small at first, but that is how the corruption starts. There was a general willingness to forgive others for their corruption. For example, it was known widely that John Perkovic was taking benefits, but it was dismissed with a laugh. That's just perky. 495. In an investigation like this, it is impossible to pierce the veil and examine organized crime. That could only be done by a properly resourced authority with coercive powers. But links can be drawn between the CFMEU and publicly available material. Those links are well and truly strong enough to support the conclusion that the CFMEU and organized crime were intermeshed. 496. Below, there are lists of individuals and companies with crime links that have received favorable treatment by the CFMEU during the Setka era. There is also a list of techniques used by organized crime which were supported by the CFMEU. 497. On one view of it, the links are so many and so strong that it suggests that the Victorian CFMEU has been at the center of a criminal network. Crime figures and criminals favored by the CFMEU. 498. The CFMEU power brokers have a long history of friendships with crime figures and convicted criminals. There are endless photos of Setka and the others socializing with criminals. That is only the start of it. The CFMEU power brokers of the time showered benefits on these known criminals. EBAs were gifted, jobs were given, businesses were promoted, invitations were extended. It has been going on for years. 499. There were so many criminals involved and so many instances of the conferral of inexplicable benefits that it can confidently be said that the leadership of the CFMEU was a participant in a larger criminal design. 500. Here are some of the known crime figures upon whom the CFMEU leadership conferred benefits. There is no way this list is complete. There are likely to be many more. As an estimate, there would probably be 2 or 3 times as many criminals who have actually gained from CFMEU favors. Mick Gatto. 501. Mick Gatto is an obvious person with whom to start. He really needs no further introduction. He is one of Australia's most notorious criminals. As noted previously in this report, Gatto has received countless benefits from a wide number of different CFMEU officials. The benefits start with multiple EBAs awarded a number of different Gatto companies in a number of different areas of building work. They included an open seat and deferential treatment during industrial negotiations between contractors and the union. 502. Gatto's benefits extended to favorable treatment for his friends and his family. The relationship is so corrupt that the CFMEU even gave him an EBA reserved for Aboriginal businesses. 503. Gatto has so many links to the crime community that there is no space to list them in a report like this. John Corey. 504. John Corey is Gatto's partner and another member of the Carlton crew. Corey has also received EBAs, although personally he has none of the necessary skills or experience to earn the EBAs. Corey, like Gatto, enjoyed preferential treatment in industrial negotiations. Corey, like Gatto, is a business associate of the heroin trafficker J. Malkoon, whose profile is described below. Figure 13, John Corey with his partner Mick Gatto. 505. Corey also works an extortion racket in Queensland. Corey and Nick Merrick were brought in to negotiate with the CFMEU on behalf of a Gold Coast developer. Corey's fee for attending an hour-long meeting was $110,000. Nick Merrick. 506. Nick Merrick works closely with Mick Gatto. He pays Gatto and John Corey a retainer for industrial relations advice. Merrick's principal business is LTE Construction Group. There are strong repeated rumors that Merrick had some kind of partnership with Gatto and Corey. 507. Merrick has had an association with multiple firebombings which have destroyed piling rigs, an essential and very expensive piece of equipment. Part of Merrick's work involves piling. Companies with whom Merrick competes had their equipment destroyed. There were several such fires occurring within a few weeks. It is true that Merrick's business was also a victim, but several people familiar with the firebombings observed that Merrick was lucky. His rigs which were destroyed were older rigs, fully or even overinsured, and he had other rigs available. Figure 14, fire at a construction site in Docklands. 508. Merrick has a close association with the Comancheros. This is problematic because a number of Merrick's competitors recounted stories of menacing visits from members of the Comancheros. 509. The manager of Merrick's business is Kristimir KB Bjelogrlic. Bjelogrlic is a Comanchero and a business partner of Bemir Benji Saracevic. Saracevic, a former national president of the Comancheros. Saracevic was jailed for over 4 years in 2023 for violent crimes and possession of a pistol. Bjelogrlic and Saracevic were recently identified as making threats to a CFMU delegate that they would burn his house down with him inside. 510. Merrick also has close connections with the Comancheros treasurer, Mark Ahern. Amongst other things, Ahern is an arsonist. He had previously been convicted and jailed for firing 8 shots into the home of a Victorian MP. 511. There are several companies associated with Merrick, but he commonly uses a frontman to disguise his involvement. For example, a group of companies with the prefix LVL give the appearance of being owned by Tony Jurek, but they are in truth at least 80% owned by Merrick. In recent times, LVL Workforce Pty Ltd has received 3 CFMEU-endorsed EBAs, 1 in the area of concrete placement and 2 for formwork. Faruk Orman, 112. Faruk Orman was convicted of the murder of the underworld figure Victor Pierce, but the conviction was set aside in the wake of the Lawyer X scandal. 513. Orman is very close to Mick Gatto. During his trial and his long spell in goal, Orman never revealed who gave the instructions to kill Pierce. Gatto organized the funding of Orman's defense and had Orman's name tattooed on his chest. It is almost as though Gatto felt he owed Orman something. All of this is covered in a separate report. 9-4. 514. Orman had all kinds of benefits showered upon him by the CFMEU shortly after his release from jail. The only reasonable inference is that this had been at the request or demand of Gatto. The benefits include a number of EBAs, not just to Orman, but also to his wife. These EBAs were granted despite Orman and his wife having no experience or training or skills in any of the areas covered by the EBAs. 515. In one instance, Orman was able to secure an EBA within a few days and on sell it for $250,000 a few days later. This is covered by an earlier report and condensed here as a case study. This is covered Malkoon. 516. Ahmed J. Malkoon is a lifelong criminal, a heroin trafficker, and a former national president of the Comancheros. He has a close relationship to Gatto. They seem to have operated a mediation or debt collection operation together. 517. Although he had no experience in any aspect of the building industry, the CFMEU under Setka's leadership awarded Malkoon's company, Base Piling Group Pty Ltd. A piling EBA in 2023.97 base piling is now defunct, but when it was operative, it boasted on its website that it was an industry partner of the CFMEU. Harry Corus, 518. Harry Corus is a notorious industry fixer who was caught out making an arrangement to benefit an apparently corrupt contractor who he encouraged to pay a fee to get a CFMEU EBA. 519. Corus is the subject of a case study. 99. Matt Thomas, 520. Matt Thomas was a partner of Mick Gatto in Elite Cranes. That business went bust in 2013-2000. 521. Thomas is a recognized associate of the Carlton crew. He was acquitted of a murder in 1996. A crime intelligence report in 2010 said that Thomas and Gatto were involved in criminal activity in the building industry and narcotics, and were connected to the Hells Angels, CFNU, and drug importers. 1-1. George Alex, 522. George Alex is a NSW-based gangster with a collaborative relationship with Gatto. 523. Currently, Alex is serving a 9-year sentence for a $10 million tax fraud arising out of his NSW building businesses. Further charges are pending trial. 524. In 2011, in one of his many scams, Alex, who has been bankrupt for many years, tried to hide assets by pretending that his close associate, Joseph Antoun, had defamed him, and that is why Anton paid him $6.2 million, noting that defamation. 99. See case study. Everyone gets to eat. 100. See Aussie gangsters and cranes don't mix. Crane Network, October 21st, 2013, and Mick Gatto Salvage's Crane Company, Sydney Morning Herald, August 21st, 2013. Dirty Deals Rife in Building Industry, Dirty Deals Rife in Building Industry, Sydney Morning Herald, January 28th, 2014. Damages are protected from the bankruptcy trustee. Bikies 15. George Alex, gangster and business partner of Gatto. Jesse Moloney, 525. Jesse Benici is or was a high-ranking patched member of the Finks. He was also a member of the CFMEU and a standover man. 526. Benici has a bricklaying business, Maurer Constructions, which has received several CFMEU ABA. Benici has a close connection to Tyrone Bell and subcontracts with Bell's solid seal companies. Selim Sami the Turk Erkan. 529. Sami Erkan was a patched Hell's Angel with deep underworld connections. 530. In 2024, Erkan was sentenced to 6 years for extortion after holding a gun to the head of an accountant, demanding $500,000 and saying he would put a hole in the accountant's head. 102. Chickdag pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of his cousin after he accidentally shot him in the chest. Chickdag ran away rather than call an ambulance. He did, however, apologize later. 531. Before that, he had been heavily supported by the CFMEU and promoted as an industrial relations advisor. On one occasion, Erkan was caught on tape boasting that, "I am now doing what Gatto was doing." Erkan's jail sentence has probably delayed his progress. Jadran Adrian Delic. 532. Jadran Delic is a union-hating crime figure with strong business and personal links to the Mokbel gang and to the convicted drug trafficker Rocco Arico. 533. Despite admitting he deliberately hides assets to defeat compensation claims made by injured workers, Delic has repeatedly received favor from the CFMEU. Why? Delic is a close personal friend of John Setka and even seems to have a business relationship with him. Antitoni Jurek. 534. Antitoni Jurek was dismissed as a police officer for corruption. After his release from jail, Jurek was able to acquire several CFMEU EBAs in the names of different companies. Jurek had no relevant skills or experience. It is reasonable to believe the EBAs were given to Jurek on the basis of his very close friendship with either John Setka or John Perkovic, or, most likely, both. 535. Jurek was mentioned in evidence in a royal commission as having a close association with the Carlton crew. It is known that Jurek is an associate of Gatto. Jurek is the frontman for a group of companies, the majority of which are owned by Nick Merrick. Marty Albert, 536. Marty Albert was a delegate, a member of the Victorian Branch Committee of Management, and a bandito. He was especially close to Joe Miles. 537. In 2023, Albert was convicted of assault, affray, and possession of methamphetamines. Despite that, Albert remained a key member of the governing body of the CFMEU at that time. 538. Albert is very close to Gatto and may have a business relationship with him. For example, when Gatto was brought in to negotiate on behalf of those who had badly bashed 2 CFMEU officials, he was accompanied to the negotiating table by Marty. Organized crime. Albert, this is covered in a case study. Luke Moloney, 539. Luke Moloney was the national president of the Hells Angels. He has an appalling criminal record. As one example, in 2023, Moloney was convicted of a serious assault. A man was bashed with a baseball bat while Moloney held him and pointed a hunting knife in his face. 540. Even though Moloney had no qualifications or experience, he was, only a few weeks after his conviction, appointed by the CFMU to a cushy job as a health and safety representative. Tyrone Little Ty Bell. 541. Bell was simultaneously the national vice president and Victorian president of the Mongols OMCG. At the same time, he was also a delegate of the CFMU. 542. Bell has been the beneficiary of a number of CFMEU-endorsed EBAs in relation to companies under the banner Solid Seal, and, in what appears to be a plain conflict of duties, was running those businesses at the same time he was a delegate. 543. It should be noted that Bell denies that he was the beneficiary of the EBAs. He says they were obtained in an arm's-length negotiation by his wife. This seems unlikely. It is also notable that one of the EBAs listed the Mongols' clubhouse as its business address. Johnny Two Guns Walker, 544. Johnny Two Guns Walker is literally a killer. He was jailed for 8 years for a vicious bashing which killed a man. He was a patched member of the Bandidos and quickly rose to become sergeant-at-arms. 104. Figure 16, Johnny Two Guns Walker, 545. Even while he was still serving his manslaughter sentence, Walker was approved for appointment as a CFMEU health and safety representative. On June 8, 2022, Elias Spernovasilis wrote to the Adult Parole Board, advising that Walker would be employed by CCL Labor. Spernovasilis told the board that the CFMEU was aware of Walker's manslaughter conviction, and that Walker's direct manager would be Mark Henry, a CFMEU organizer with close connections to Joe Miles. Joel Levitt, 546. Joe Levitt is a brutal criminal with a bad criminal record. He was patched by the rebels OMCG, 547. Levitt only joined the union in October 2017. In 19, then close to Joe Miles. Levitt was appointed as a health and safety representative in April 2019. The paperwork shows that there was no election. It simply says he was elected by Paul Tsimas. The records are unclear, but it seems Levitt never underwent any training for this role. 548. As part of his employment package, Levitt was earning more than $200,000 and given a government-funded car. 549. In 2023, Levitt was shot while in the rebels' clubhouse. He was able to get to a hospital using the government car. Naturally, in accordance with the Bikie Code of Silence, Levitt has refused to assist the police. Joel Brown. 550. Joel Brown was patched by the Mongols. He was brought in by Setka as an enforcer in the September 2021 riots outside the CFMEU offices. There is a video recording showing Brown violently dealing with protesters. 551. Apparently, as a reward, Brown was appointed as a delegate at Hickory Alphington in October 2021. Cain Montebello. 552. Cain Montebello was president of the Dark Side chapter of the Hells Angels. 553. He was one of the 3 Hells Angels who badly bashed a man. Montebello was striking the man with a baseball bat. On December 11, 2023, within weeks of his conviction, Montebello was appointed as CFMEU health and safety representative. There is no record of an election. Vamp Cranes. 554. Vamp Cranes was the beneficiary of a CFMEU EBA. 555. Its then manager, Ross Gimona, is a convicted killer. He stabbed his cellmate while on remand. 556. Outlaw motorcycle gangs. 557. In a field where loyalties are aggressively tribal, the CFMEU during the Setka era has been promiscuous in its relationships with OMCGs. It seems to have made connections with many. 558. That said, there might have been a particular affinity with the rebels. As long ago as 2003, the National Crime Authority had picked up intelligence that Mick Gatto had connections with the rebels and that he had brokered a meeting between the president of the rebels, Melbourne chapter, and the CFMEU. 559. These are some of the links which are able to be made, together with the role they, Organised Crime, had under the old CFMEU. Again, there is no way that this list is comprehensive. 106. Rebels, Dean Martin, Delegate, Joel Levitt, Health and Safety Rep, Eli Seco, Delegate, Jamal Pearson, Delegate, Stewie Corcoran, Delegate, Hells Angels, Luke Moloney, Health and Safety Rep, Cain Montebello, Health and Safety Rep, Julian Asafiri, Health and Safety Rep, Sam Erkan, closely connected to the CFMEU executive. Comancheros, J. Malkoon, EBA winner. Nick Merrick, EBA winner and closely connected to the CFNU executive. Mongols, Tyrone Bell, delegate and EBA winner. Joel Brown, delegate, Bandidos. Johnny Walker, delegate. Marty Albert, organizer and BCOM member. The Finks, Jesse Benici, EBA winner. Organized crime methods associated with the CFMU. 560. The CFMU was centrally involved in several rackets commonly associated with organized crime. These are just some examples. Extortion, 561. The use of extortion was covered earlier. See the section titled Threats and Extortion. It is also covered in the case studies. 562. The point is that it was the CFMEU which was providing the lever for the gangsters to extort the contractors. Without the support of the CFMEU, the gangsters' threats would have been idle. But those who were facing the extortion were well aware that if they failed to comply, they would suffer the consequences. 563. Why would the CFMEU have supported this? The answer is obvious. There is a lot of money in extortion, and the officials at the CFMEU would not have been providing support without being paid for it. Debt collection. 564. The building industry has always been prone to disputes involving debt collection. Sometimes the claims are genuine, but it is often the case that claims are fake or grossly exaggerated. The building industry is swamped with standover men and urgers using threats and violence to collect debts, real or imagined. 565. The debt collection business is very lucrative. The former head of the Comancheros, J. Malkoon, is a debt collector. He was in a business with Gatto and tells of an occasion when he and Gatto had a chat with the proprietor of a concreting company and recovered a $400,000 debt. Our end was $200,000, 50% standard for recovery, to us anyway. That was our price. 566. The CFMU has been directly involved in debt recovery in different ways. 567. One way this is exemplified is by the story of how Mick Gatto was telling the two developers that he could stop the development from continuing. That story was told earlier. 568. A second way is by supplying the muscle to stand behind a threat of violence or even by inflicting the actual violence. An example of that was given when the organizer, Andrew De Bono, punched a building executive in the back of the head. 569. A third way is the CFMEU actually triggering the debt recovery process, apparently acting as an agent for a favored company or even acting for its own benefit. Organized crime. 571. When a resolution could not be found, things became hostile. It was, the contractor said, as though the CFMEU officials were collecting the money for themselves. Black market EBAs. 573. The corruption here is well documented. 574. Desperate characters are eager to enter the building industry to get their hands on the big money generated by the big build. A CFMEU-endorsed EBA is the entry ticket. There is a willingness to pay large sums to buy an entry ticket. 575. This issue has been fully covered in the earlier section of this report on enterprise bargaining agreements. Drug trafficking. 576. There is no doubt that drugs have been regularly bought, sold, and used on Melbourne building sites. The suppliers are Melbourne's largest source of illicit drugs, the OMCGs. This issue was raised on in the section Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. 577. The debatable issue is the extent to which the CFMEU has had a role in this. 578. What is known is that CFMEU officials were advancing the careers of bikies by having them appointed as delegates or HSRs, even within days of joining the union and in the absence of any qualifications or experience. Some appointees had drug convictions. It could reasonably be inferred that these bikies were being strategically placed onto sites with a view to have them represent their OMCG's interests on a particular site. 579. This is an especially serious matter which cannot be addressed in a report like this. It requires the immediate attention of an investigative body with a full suite of coercive powers. A crossover with the tobacco wars. 580. For years, Melbourne has been in the grip of gangland wars over the massive illicit tobacco market. These have become known as the tobacco wars. It is serious. In June 2025, the esteemed crime journalist John Sylvester said, "There have been 141 arsons and 7 murders in Melbourne connected with the tobacco wars in the last couple of years." 109. The numbers have probably gone up since then. 581. The CFMEU has previously had 2 connections with the tobacco wars. 582. The first was through a health and safety representative, Muhammed Hassan Sayan. This story is more fully recounted in a case study. On 583. On October 7, 2020, 3 gunmen opened fire in a suburban shopping center car park, killing one man, Robert Issa, and seriously injuring another. Issa was a violent gangster centrally involved in the tobacco wars. His murder was undoubtedly an execution by a rival tobacco gang. 584. There are press reports that the rival tobacco gang is controlled by a Middle Eastern crime organization. Organized crime. 585. On July 30th, 2025, Sayan was arrested and charged with Robert Issa's murder. At the time of his arrest, Sayan was a health and safety representative of the CFMEU. At the time 11, 589. 590. The second crossover between the CFMEU and the tobacco wars is through a member, Jamal Pearson. Pearson was a CFMEU young activist and a close associate of Joe Miles. 591. Pearson is a patched member of the rebels. In January 2025, he was jailed for 11 months after being convicted of an arson attack on a tobacconist store in Orbost. Pearson and a co-offender threw a jerry can of accelerant through the glass door, setting fire to the premises and causing significant damage. 592. The magistrate described it as planned targeted attack for which the arsonists were paid by an unknown source. Dated the 20th of January + Geoffrey Watson. 112. This matter is the subject of case study 17, Muhammad Sayan and the Tobacco Wars. The case studies. 593. These case studies provide more details surrounding particular instances of crime and corruption briefly described in the text of the report. 594. In no sense are these comprehensive. Dozens of other case studies could have been chosen. Case study 1. 595. 596. 597. 598, 595, 600, 507, the hashing, 607. On June the 30th, 2020, 2 senior organizers at the CFMEU, Ronnie Buckley and Paul Tsimas, were badly bashed on a construction site in Hawthorn East. 608. Even though everyone knows who was behind the bashing, no one has been brought to justice. The police have been prevented from conducting a full investigation. A substantial amount of money, suggested to be in the order of $200,000, has changed hands as compensation, but not 1 cent went to either Buckley or Tsimas. 609. How did this come about? 610. The site at Hawthorn East was being developed by Raman Shakiri and Stefshi Kudlasovsky, using a corporate vehicle known as Shack City Pty Limited. Shakiri and Kudlasovsky are controversial characters. Another development in which they were involved led to the illegal demolition of the historic Corkman Hotel. They were heavily fined for this, and the heritage building is still unrestored. 611. Shaqiri and Kutlasovsky were developing the site using non-EBA contractors and were determined to keep the CFMU from any involvement in the development. 612. On June 29, 2020, a CFMU organizer, Paulo Jumara, went to the Hawthorn East site and, although accounts vary, appears to have stirred up action suggesting that the CFMU would return to the site the next day. 613. At about 7:30 a.m. on June 30, 2020, Buckley and Seamus attempted to enter the Hawthorn East site. It seems that the purpose of the visit was to encourage or persuade the developers to enter into an EBA with the CFMU. At 614. There is a dispute as to whether their entry was in accordance with the law. A spokesperson for the CFMU maintained that Buckley and Seamus had all their paperwork in order. However, Shaqiri's lawyer stated that the pair attended the site without entry documents and that they refused to respond to the request for production of these documents. That does not really matter. Even if the entry was unlawful, it would not justify attacking Buckley and Seamus. 615. There is something of a dispute about what happened next. Shaqiri's lawyer stated that the pair were asked to leave. They then became physically aggressive, and 2 staff members of the builder acted defensively. John Setka claimed that these young officials were simply doing their job when met with an organized assault by a group of cowards. According to a claim against Shaqiri's company filed by the Victorian Work Cover Authority, when Buckley and Seamus attempted to enter, Shaqiri stopped them with, "What the fuck do you want?" and told them to fuck off, and that was when the assault commenced. 115. 616. There is no doubt Buckley and Seamus were attacked. The attackers included a contractor, Sheriff Elias, and a well-known group of Albanian thugs. Shaqiri himself is known as Ray the Albanian. Darius is or was a patch Mongol. Some estimates are that there were 7 attackers. It has been suggested that some of this same group of attackers carried out the demolition of the Corkman Hotel. 617. The obvious inference is that Shaqiri and Kutlasovsky brought the Albanians onto the site knowing that CFMU officials were likely to come that day. 618. The Albanians took to Buckley and Seamus with some kinds of weapons. There is a suggestion they were attacked with metal poles and another that Buckley and Seamus were bashed pieces of timber. Setka claimed that one of the officials hit across the head with a lump of timber and knocked unconscious. 619. Buckley was knocked out and taken to the hospital unconscious. He has permanently lost the use of an eye. He has also suffered devastating psychological injury. Buckley has never been able to return to work. He is a recluse, effectively trapped within his own home due to his fear of reprisals. Seamus was slightly luckier. He was taken to hospital and released, but a later MRI scan disclosed that his ankle had been fractured. Seamus had surgery, a full ankle reconstruction, which has been sufficiently successful so that he was able to return to his work as an organizer after 12 weeks rehabilitation. 620. The ordinary members of the CFMU were justifiably outraged. The next day they attended the site en masse. It is estimated that 250 men attended a protest outside the site. Figure 17, part of the protest outside the Hawthorn East site, at least the members were concerned. 621. The odd feature here is that while the membership was outraged, the leadership of the CFMU then set out to cover the matter up. 624. 625. Meanwhile, some action was being taken. The Albanians brought in Mick Gatto to represent them in a meeting with Setka at the CFMU offices. It remains unclear who initiated the negotiations. Derek Christopher, Elias Spernovasilis, and John Perkovic were also present at the negotiations. Marty Albert, a CFMU organizer, was also involved in negotiations, but it is not clear why or on whose side Albert was present. 626. When he was asked about this, Derek Christopher said that the CFMU had decided not to engage with the police and instead went to Mr. Gatto to negotiate. And when pressed as to why Gatto would be preferred to the police, he said, "This happens every day." 627. The secrecy surrounding these negotiations is such that it is necessary to rely upon rumors. Several sources said that money changed hands. It is not clear whether that money came from Shaqiri and Kutlasovsky or Darius or the Albanian gang. A few sources suggested that the payment was $200,000. But it is not clear as to whom any payment was made. 628. Apart from that, the proposals put forward by the CFMU were lame. Shaqiri agreed to raise a CFMU flag on the site. He was also asked to negotiate an EBA, but that was not pursued. It seems the real issue as far as the CFMU negotiators were concerned was the money. Apparently the payment was made as a kind of compensation, but if it was, nothing was paid to the injured organizers, Buckley and Seamus. If the money was paid, it seems to have been pocketed by somebody in the CFMU executive. 630. In public, Setka offered his support of the pair, stating, "No one should go to work and be brutally attacked. We are all disgusted." In private, it was the opposite. Even though Buckley has been badly injured, Setka's only contact was to tell Buckley not to go to the police. He never followed up on Buckley's well-being and privately described Buckley's continuing psychological problem as demonstrating that Buckley was a weak cunt. 631. Buckley has sued the CFMU and Shaqiri's company. In an astonishing allegation, and directly contrary to Setka's public statements, the CFMEU has blamed Buckley. The case studies. For what happened to him, pleading that Buckley failed to use his common sense, Shaqiri has defended the claim in the basis that Buckley was inciting and/or encouraging violence against him. 117. Case Study 3, 632, 633, 634, 635, 636, 630, 638, 640, 641, 117. See the pleadings in Buckley Fee 8 and ANOR CI 24000847. 642, 642, 643, 646, 645, 643, 648, 648, 648, 149, 656, 657, 656, 658, 658, 667, 665, 665, 665, 675, 676, 122. The case studies. The case studies. Case in 76. Who wants to work in Occo? 683. Rail upgrades and level crossing removals were amongst the most significant parts of the big build. Any work on existing rail services is bound to disrupt commuters. Any disruption needs to be controlled and confined. Occasionally, the rail traffic has to be stopped completely and the builders given control. This is known as a rail occupation. Amongst those on site, a rail occupation is known as an Occo. 685. An Occo has to be for as short a period as possible to minimize disruption to the traveling public. As a further measure to minimize disruption, a rail occupation would usually be planned around weekends and, for longer closures, around public holidays. To keep the builders' minds focused on the need to deliver the rail service back to the traveling public, the government contracted with the builders to impose, in effect, financial penalties if they ran over time. These were severe. A typical example was thousands of dollars a minute. 686. This delivered a whip to the hand of the CFMEU. The union knew that the slightest interruption to a rail occupation was a financial nightmare for the builder. The CFMEU had complete control. 687. For example, one rail occupation at Hurstbridge was scheduled to take 8 days, which included the Easter break. The CFMEU had scheduled an additional 4-day CFMEU holiday around the traditional 4 holidays of Easter. That meant the rail occupation covered 8 days of CFMEU holidays. The builder, 100, faced massive penalties for delay. It had to complete the rail occupation on time. The CFMEU negotiated a position under which workers received triple pay for the whole 8-day period. Then rain hit, and the CFMEU demanded more. The supervisors at 100 had no choice but to agree to pay the workers quadruple time. 688. It was a bonanza for those lucky enough to get a job during that Occo. Wage records show, just as on example, an unskilled laborer received over $15,000 in 1 week during that period. 115,000 work in 89. Given the money to be made, everyone wanted to work in Occo. It also meant that anyone who had influence would try to have their family and friends employed to work in Occo. 690. The CFMEU began to use its industrial muscle to make sure its picks would be selected for an Occo. In the period leading up to an Occo, lists were given to the building company's site superintendents. These were the names of persons whom the CFMEU was insisting be employed on the Occo. This was accompanied by an implicit threat. Unless these persons were employed, the site would be stopped due to an industrial dispute. 691. What follows is one example, drawn from a particular rail occupation on the Hurstbridge site. It is not exceptional. What occurred here was happening on sites all around Melbourne. 692. 693. It needs to be noted that none of these people were actually rostered onto work during the Occo. They were being added to an already full roster. And none of these people were necessary for the Occo. They were just add-ons, unnecessary and unwanted workers who were joining the Occo gravy train. 694. It has become possible to identify most of the connections which led to these people being on this list. 695. The people listed were all drawn from workers registered with particular labor hire companies. All of them had strong bonds with the CFMEU. The labor hire companies identified in the text message are Top Up, a large and successful business with strong links to John Setka and John Perkovic. WIC, an abbreviation for Women in Construction, a firm with a social procurement EBA to advantage women, but with a problematic reputation. Dardy Munwaro is a firm with an Indigenous Social Procurement EBA. OCC. This is a reference to OCC Services Pty Ltd, a firm which at the time was under a serious cloud of criminal allegations, but has since changed hands and has cleaned up its ways. 696. Then there are the individual names. Not all of them have been able to be identified, but amongst those who have been able to be identified, it is clear why they got the advantage of the Occo. James Bougea, connections unknown. Timothy Carter, a personal friend of the site delegate, Joel. Joseph Gitani, a friend of the organizer Costa Josefides. Daikon Naidu, connections unknown. Joshua Sida, a friend of Levitt. Christos Sakos, a friend of Levitt. Yasmin Kias, Levitt's cousin. Amira Taleb, Yasmin Kias's best friend. Jamal Pearson, a patched rebel and a close ally of Levitt. Dennis Peach, a rebels prospector and ally of Levitt. Paul Bruce, engaged to the daughter of the CFMEU delegate Andy Struthers. Robert Boyce, a friend of the site superintendent. Giuseppe Colazzi, a bouncer and bodybuilder, but connections unknown. David Pinozzo, connections unknown. Stephen Vasilou, the brother of the CFMU delegate Jimmy Vasilou. Levitt, Jacob Logan, a friend of Levitt, a boxer and a patched rebel. Thaisa Tibos, Shannon Tibos' daughter, grandniece of Derek Christopher. Davis Jaske, another friend of the site superintendent. Case Study 7, John Perkovic Real Estate. 697. John Perkovic was a very senior organizer. He was dismissed from his position in October 2025, mainly due to the conduct which is disclosed in this case study. 698. Perkovic's position in the union seemed bulletproof. He was a close personal friend of John Setka and had enjoyed Setka's patronage throughout his career. Perkovic was high up in the informal power structure of the CFMEU, holding a position of influence just below that of Setka. He was genuinely popular, known universally as Perky. Not long before he was dismissed, he had been appointed by Zach Smith as a coordinator, which made him the second most powerful person in the operational side of the union. 699. This was perceived by some to be a real problem. For two reasons. The first was that Perkovic was so close to Setka that many thought his appointment was reintroducing Setka's influence through the back door. The second problem was that it was widely known and widely discussed that Perkovic was corrupt and had received many benefits over many years from many sources. This case study focuses only upon corruption surrounding Perkovic's purchase and development of 2 blocks of land in East Keilor. 700. Between 2020 and 2024, Perkovic and his family were involved in a series of corrupt property transactions. The transactions netted at least $1 million for Perkovic. 701. The principal persons on the other side of the corrupt transactions were Tony Jurek and George Nestorovsky. There is no innocent explanation for the transactions involving Perkovic, Jurek, and Nestorovsky. They are clearly wrongful. 702. The transactions were in 2 parts. This is the first part. 703. In December 2017, Perkovic purchased a property known as 1/14 Hislop Street in Keilor for $650,000. The property was placed in the name of Perkovic's wife, but other correspondence shows that was not accurate and that it was purchased for their joint benefit. 704. It is not clear how the purchase was financed. At one stage, when being questioned, Perkovic said it was through a mortgage with the ANZ for $550,000 or $600,000 or something, but later he seemed to say that it was $350,000 to $400,000 with the Bank of Melbourne. The property records show an original mortgage to ANZ was transferred to Westpac on March 27, 2017, and discharged on February 5, 2025. And discharged on 5, the new property typical suburban Battle Axe subdivision. It will be convenient to call 1/14 Hislop Street the front block. There was an old house on the front block, and Perkovic had plans to demolish the old house and build a new one. 706. Plans were prepared for a modern 2-story home. Aerial photography shows the old house was demolished sometime between April and September 2019. By September 2019, some building work had commenced, partly due to COVID. The building process was very drawn out and was only completed in about July 2023. 707. The building company retained by Perkovic was Macon Building, a business owned by Tony Jurek. 708. Tony Jurek was drummed out of Victoria Police for corruption. After he completed a 2-year jail sentence, Jurek entered the building sector with the assistance of his long-term friends John Setka and John Perkovic. 709. Perkovic and Jurek are very close. Perkovic honors Jurek with the title Kume, or uncle, and is godfather to one of Jurek's children. In that way, it may seem natural that Perkovic would use Jurek as his builder, but given Jurek is a contractor with interests on commercial sites where Perkovic could influence the allocation of EBAs and the awarding of contracts, the building arrangement should have been declared. It was not declared. 710. Jurek is a close associate of a number of notoriously corrupt individuals. There were intelligence reports in the Royal Commission into Management of Police Informants identifying Jurek as a close associate of Mick Gatto and other known criminals. Jurek was described as an associate of the Carlton Crew crime gang. Jurek is a friend and business partner of the underworld figure Nick Merrick. Jurek co-owns and stands as the public face of a number of companies principally owned by Merrick. They have the prefix LVL, including LVL Workforce. 711. While Jurek was building Perkovic's house, LVL Workforce received a CFMEU-approved EBA. Perkovic was aware of this and possibly organized it. An email dated March 3, 2023 shows that Derek Christopher, another close ally of Perkovic, had initiated the process of awarding LVL Workforce the EBA. Perkovic was copied in on the process. When Perkovic was asked if he had assisted an LVL company with getting an EBA, he at first said, "Not me, never." But when he was told about the email, he changed his evidence to, "Maybe, I don't remember." 712. The evidence of the arrangements for the building of the new house raises many questions. When Perkovic was asked how much the building works cost, he was evasive. At first, he responded that he did not know, but when he was pressed, he said, maybe it cost 350 or 450,000. 713. This seems unlikely to be correct. On July 27, 2023, Perkovic insured the buildings on the front block for $750,000. It is likely the real cost of the works was around $500,000, maybe more. 714. When Perkovic was asked about his building contract with Macon, he said there was probably no written contract. If this is so, given the size of the job, a written contract was required by statute, and the failure to provide a contract by Macon would be a breach of the law and subject to a penalty. And subject. 15. When asked whether the building agreement was for a fixed price or on a costs-plus basis, Perkovic said he did not know. When asked how much and where he borrowed the money to fund the cost of building the new house, he responded, borrow, ands maybe, the dollars. My missus does that. 716. Of course, this could have been cleared up by Tony Jurek, but multiple attempts to contact him went unanswered. 717. But that is only the first part of the corrupt transactions. This is the second part, 718. The second part of the transaction relates to the acquisition of 2/14 Hislop Street, the back block. Perkovic came to own the back block in circumstances showing it was plainly a benefit given to him by the wealthy contractor, George Nestorovsky. 719. At the time construction of the new Perkovic home on the front block commenced, the back block remained in the hands of its original owner. 720. On June 2, 2020, the back block was sold to a company, GSN Projects Pty Ltd, for $500,000. There does not seem to have been a marketing campaign to sell the back block, and there is no sign that a real estate agent was involved in the sale. 721. The purchaser, GSN Projects, is a company owned by George Nestorovsky. 127. The purchase 24 GSN Projects sold the back block to Perkovic's daughter for $550,000. 723. There are several strange features of this transaction, and they all point to the sale being an unsophisticated sham worked out between Perkovic and Nestorovsky. One feature is that the price is too low. In that area, property prices had increased by 40% between 2020 and 2024. The sale price reflected a meager 10% increase. 128. There seems to have been no marketing campaign for the sale of the back block. No real estate agent was involved. It was a direct sale, vendor to purchaser. It is also hard to understand how Perkovic's daughter could purchase the property. She was a 20-year-old student purchasing a bare block of land for $550,129. 724. But far and away, the most disturbing feature is that no money changed hands. The back block was transferred to Perkovic's daughter for free. 725. This was a matter of puzzlement to Perkovic's conveyancers. Those conveyancers sent emails querying the arrangement because they were instructed that the purchaser had paid a $550,000 deposit on a $550,000 purchase, i.e. no money changed hands at the moment the contract was finalized. 726. When the back block was transferred and there was no mortgage on the title, meaning that if Perkovic's daughter had actually paid anything, she had paid it in cash. 127. The only explanations are that Nestorovsky transferred the back block to Perkovic for free, or that Perkovic had $550,000 in cash available. Neither explanation is consistent with an innocent transaction. 728. The combined benefit to Perkovic was substantial. On November 28, 2024, his accountants provided him with a spreadsheet which, amongst other things, estimated the developed property at 1/14 Hislop Street to be worth $1.8 million and the undeveloped property at 2/14 Hislop Street at $1 million. 729. It was not possible to get a full account from Perkovic to explain how all of this unfolded. During his interview, he became aware that his daughter had been contacted by a journalist and terminated the discussion. 730. In an initial contact, Nestorovsky said he had the documents to prove the transactions were above board, that he wanted to meet, and promised to provide the documents. He then saw a lawyer and ceased contact. Case Study 8. John Perkovic's motor cars. 731. There are 3 members of the Perkovic family. Between them, they have 4 cars, but they only ever owned 1 car, and it is not clear that they paid for it. 732. The first car is John Perkovic's work vehicle, a Ford Everest SUV. The Everest was provided by the CFMEU and can be put aside for present purposes. 733. The second car is a silver 1970 Falcon GT, a collector's item and the original Australian muscle car. These Falcon GTs are rare. It would have a market value well in excess of $100,000. It would have a Perkovic drives the Falcon GT, pays to get it serviced, and keeps it in his garage. Perkovic says he does not own it. Rather, he says he is just storing it for his friend Steve Mellick. 734. The third car is driven by Perkovic's wife. It is a black 2025 Range Rover worth in excess of $100,000. When asked how the purchase was financed, Perkovic said, "At the moment, it is owned by George Nestorovsky." 735. The fourth car is driven by Perkovic's daughter. It is a black 2020 BMW 218Y, which Perkovic said he bought for 40-odd. When Perkovic said he borrowed the money from Nick. 736. None of these explanations is satisfactory. 737. As for the Falcon GT, Steve Melech owns Top Up, one of the largest and most profitable of the few labor hire companies with a CFMEU EBA. Supported Top Up to win lucrative contracts by directing contractors to get their labor hire from Top Up. 738. It seems probable that the storage story is a sham and the Falcon GT was a gift from Melech. 739. But even if the Falcon GT had only been lent by Melech to Perkovic, that was still a benefit from a contractor and should have been declared. It was not declared. It was kept a secret. 740. As for the Range Rover, George Nestorovsky is a building contractor. He owns successful cleaning and site signage companies which Perkovic has routinely supported. It is well known that Perkovic pressed contractors to subcontract their work to Nestorovsky's companies. 741. Again, we only have Perkovic's assertion that it is a loan rather than a gift. There are other corrupt arrangements between Perkovic and Nestorovsky which suggest the provision of the Range Rover was a payoff of some kind. 130. 742. As for the BMW, documents have been recovered which show that it was purchased in the name of John Perkovic on May 1, 2023 for $48,831. The sales information suggests that it was a cash transaction. 743. When Perkovic was pressed, he remembered that the Nick from whom he borrowed the money was Nick Lee, the owner of Expocanti, which describes itself as a Tier 1 internal fit-out contractor. 744. Perkovic's and Lee's inconsistent accounts about the loan suggest it was a sham transaction. 745. The stories do not match. Perkovic said he bought the car 4 or 5 years ago, was uncertain if the agreement was in writing, uncertain if any interest was payable, and said there was no repayment schedule. Rather, he repays the loan when I get the cash. He claims that over the years he has repaid 30,000 odd. Meanwhile, Nick Lee says he lent the money to Perkovic because Perkovic got a good deal but was short of money, that the loan agreement was in writing, that the loan was for 20 or 30, that no interest was payable, the repayment schedule was that Perkovic would repay $10,000 first, and that the loan was completely repaid. 746. On October 28, 2025, Lee sent through a copy of the written agreement. That agreement, which is set out below, does not coincide with any of the oral evidence. 747. The loan agreement was made on May 1, 2023. The loan was for $56,000, which does not match up with the cost of the BMW and does not match up with either of Perkovic's or Lee's recollection of the size of the loan. The loan agreement suggests that $7,169 was paid as interest up front, which is a strange arrangement in its own right. The term of the loan was specified as 3 years. That would mean that $2,390 was paid as interest on each year of the 3-year term, which suggests an interest rate of 4.267% per annum. 748. The repayment schedule is equally puzzling. It seems to involve 2 steps. One is to make the borrower able to return the money periodically, which is a very odd way of expressing an obligation to make payments. The second step is that everything has to be repaid by April 30th, 2026. The document then bears an annotation which might be seen to suggest that $10,000 was repaid in 2023 and another $10,000 was repaid in 2024, but that is far from clear. Figure another 22, 749. The loan agreement is obviously unsatisfactory, but in some ways that does not matter. The real issue here is whether it was appropriate for Perkovic, as a CFMEU organizer, to borrow money from a contractor, which plainly it was not. Case Study 9, the Bikies arrive. 750. According to the Setka-era CFMEU, Bikies were not a problem within the CFMEU. This was repeatedly said by John Setka, Derek Christopher, Joe Miles, Rob Graumans, and others. 751. This was patently untrue. 752. Those members of the old executive conceded that there were some Bikies on some sites, but that was to be expected, especially where the work was physical. The old executive claimed that the number of Bikies were unexceptional. In particular, the old executive maintained the few Bikies on sites were ordinary workers and presented no risk of violence or crime. 753. This too was patently untrue. 754. The fact was that the number of Bikies in representative positions of the CFMEU and working on sites as members of the CFMEU was disproportionately high. The suggestion that the Bikies did not come with a risk of crime or violence is risible. As is shown elsewhere in this report, the OMCGs had taken control of building sites as drug distribution points, and they were willing to fight to maintain control of those sites. 755. This is a short list of just some of the Bikies who were forced onto employers as delegates or HSRs by the Setka-era CFMEU. It is certain to be incomplete, and there would be many more than those listed here, and there would be member of the Bandidos. Joel Leland criminal. Originally a member of the Bandidos, he was only 20 when he was convicted and jailed following a riot outside a Gold Coast restaurant. Even by that stage, he was described as having an appalling history of public offending. 757. In 2019, Levitt came to Melbourne and was appointed a delegate and a health and safety representative. It does not appear that Levitt was trained or qualified for the job. Many have said that he attended sites only rarely. 758. At some point, Levitt had left the Bandidos and joined the rebels. In 23, he was shot by a rival gang while he was in a rebels clubhouse. 759. After he was shot, Levitt was ironically driven to hospital in car which was provided to him for his work as a health and safety representative. That car was funded by the Victorian taxpayer. Luke Moloney. 760. Luke Moloney was the national president of the Hells Angels and is a long-term criminal with multiple convictions. For example, in 2023, he was convicted for a violent assault in which Moloney was brandishing a hunting knife while two other Hells Angels beat a man with a baseball bat. Shortly after, he was arrested again for possessing drugs of addiction and an imitation AK-47. 761. On August 31, 2023, Moloney joined the CFMEU. On September 13, 2023, he was appointed a delegate and HSR. Moloney was convicted for the bashing on October 23, 2023. 762. The circumstances of how Moloney came into the CFMEU are so extraordinary, they are covered in a separate case study. 763. In 2014, Johnny Two Guns Walker, together with two other Bandidos, beat a man to death with a steel pole inside a Bandidos clubhouse. When they finished killing him, they rolled up the man's body in an old rug and dumped him in East Keilor. Walker was charged with murder, but a deal was struck under which Walker pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 8 years in jail. 764. Walker got out of jail in about April 2022. His parole application was supported by Elias Spernovasilis. He became a member of the CFMEU on July 19, 2022, and was immediately made a delegate. Ordinarily, the position of a delegate is one earned by skill, dedication, and long service to the union. It would usually take years before an ordinary worker could become a delegate. Tyrone Bell, 765. Tyrone Little Ty Bell was the national vice president and a chapter president of the Mongols. He worked or works closely with Jesse Benici of the Finks and Sam. Sammy the Turk Erkin, a well-known Hells Angels enforcer who is currently in jail for holding a gun to the head of an accountant. 766. On September 19, 2023, Bell was made a delegate of the CFMU. The records are unclear, but it seems he did not undergo any training for that work. He has concurrently conducted businesses under CFMEU-endorsed EBAs. Marty Albert, 767. Marty Albert was or is the sergeant-at-arms for the Bandidos in their Melbourne chapter. A sergeant-at-arms is an enforcer, imposing what is described as discipline. As Sergeant-Latin, Marty Albert came to the Victorian branch in late 2018, apparently as part of a group brought down from Queensland by Joe Miles. Figure 23, Marty Albert, a member of the governing body of the CFMU. Albert in 69. In October 2023, Albert instigated a violent brawl between Bandidos and two men. The men were very seriously injured. Albert was convicted of assault, affray, and possession of methamphetamines. At the time, he was an elected representative on the CFMU governing body. Joel Brown, 770. Joel Brown was patched by the Mongols, 771. In the absence of skills or experience, he was appointed a delegate in October 2021. Brown became a personal favorite of John Setka after he violently bashed protesters gathered at the CFMU offices in September 2021. Dean Martin, 772. Dean Martin was the national president of the Rebels, a role so high that he represented Australia at the Rebels' international meetings. 773. Martin is a NZ national and resided in Australia on a visa. In 2023, the Minister for Home Affairs cancelled Martin's visa on character grounds, and he was set to be deported back to NZ. At the last moment, Martin avoided deportation by proving that he was Aboriginal and therefore entitled to protection under the High Court's decision on Aboriginality. 774. Martin is close to Joel Shackleton. 775. Martin was appointed a delegate in November 2022. Kane Montebello, 700, and delegate in November, was the president of the Darkside chapter of the Hells Angels. He is a kickboxer. Montebello was charged and convicted over the same vicious bashing for which Luke Moloney was convicted. It was Montebello who hit the man with the baseball bat while Moloney pinned the man down. The man's offense? He wanted to leave the Hells Angels and join the Mongols. 777. Montebello joined the Union in 2018 and became a delegate on December 11, 2023, just a few weeks after he was convicted for the violent assault. Julian Asafiri. 778. Julian Asafiri was a sergeant-at-arms of the Hells Angels. In February 2022, Asafiri joined Moloney and Montebello in bashing a man with a baseball bat and threatening him with a knife. Asafiri was convicted and sentenced in 2023. 779. Just a few weeks later, Asafiri was appointed as a delegate. It is true that his approval says that he had been elected to that role, but on the details of the election, all it says is that he was elected by Paul Tsimas. Figure 24, Julian Asafiri. Eliseko Seko, 780. Eliseko Seko was a rebel and one of 5 men charged in 2019 with a raft of offenses including blackmail, carjacking, and making death threats. He was described as a member of an extortion and blackmail syndicate controlled by the rebels. The allegation against Seko was that he had waved a gun in the face of a 21-year-old and asked him, "Do you want me to kill you?" 781. Seko appears to have become a delegate on March 28, 2024, and it appears he may still be discharging that role. Stui Corcoran. And it appears he may still be discharging that role as a path to rebels. He was exposed as a member of an OMCG when he addressed a Bikie protest in full colors, but, a little foolishly, used a CFMEU branded megaphone. 783. Corcoran remains loyal to John Setka. In October 2025, he posted a video recording of himself leading a group of workers in a chant, "Johnny Setka, here to stay." Case Study 10. Luke Moloney joins the CFMEU. 784. Luke Moloney is the worst kind of violent bikie. 785. Moloney was a president of the Hells Angels. He proudly wears a filthy few patch, which is a Hells Angels equivalent of the Victoria Cross, except it is not awarded for valor. It is awarded for an act of extreme violence. Moloney has a long string. 786. Of criminal convictions from violence to intimidation to drugs to possessing weapons. Figure 25, Luke Moloney, a proud member of the filthy few. Yet Moloney was appointed a health and safety representative by the CFMU. 787. In fact, it was while Moloney was awaiting trial for a vicious assault, he was picked up and appointed as a health and safety representative of the CFMU, and this was despite an absence of experience and training. 788. How did this occur? 789. The principal persons behind Moloney's appointment were the organizer Jerry McCrudden and Joe Miles. Each has given an account, but neither account is believable. The only available inference is that Moloney corrupted the process or that McCrudden and Miles were paid or were performing a favor for a third party. There is no innocent explanation for this. 790. McCrudden was asked about this incident in the middle of 2024. When he was asked if he knew any bikies, he quickly responded no, but then, just as quickly, was reminded by his lawyer about Luke Moloney. 791. Once prompted, McCrudden did manage to recall some facts relating to the appointment of Moloney. He gave an account that, about a year before, McCrudden was eating his lunch in a noodle box restaurant in Pakenham. McCrudden says that he was wearing his CFMU vest and he was eating with another organizer, Rob Janjic. McCrudden says that without notice, he was approached by a man who introduced himself as Luke Moloney, told McCrudden that he was working for SMW Earthworks and that he wanted to get recognized. Moloney gave McCrudden his number, 792. According to McCrudden, this brief exchange about getting recognized was treated as a formal application to be appointed as a delegate. 793. According to McCrudden, Janjic then said to McCrudden, "Do you know who that was?" McCrudden said no and then Googled Luke Moloney's name. He says he quickly found out that Moloney was a serious bikie, so he telephoned Moloney and told him if he wanted to get recognized, he would have to drop his colors. Moloney then told McCrudden that he would do so, but could not until a current court case he was facing was resolved. McCrudden said he accepted Moloney's word on this. 794. Moloney was facing court proceedings. It was his criminal trial for a vicious bashing. Ironically, given McCrudden's request that Moloney drop his colors, the reason why Moloney was bashing the man was because the man wanted to terminate his membership of the Hells Angels. There were 3 Hells Angels involved in the bashing: Moloney, Cain Montebello, and Julian Asafiri. Moloney's role was to threaten the man by pushing a hunting knife in the man's face. 795. As at the time McCrudden was meeting Moloney, a simple Google search of Luke Moloney's name would have produced results recounting the story of the bashing and the charges laid against Moloney for assault with a weapon and extortion. It would have revealed that Moloney had committed these offenses while he was out on bail on other charges. It would have revealed that Moloney had been, mostly, remanded in custody while awaiting trial. 796. McCrudden was asked if he attempted to find any of this information, but said, "I did not look into it as I was not really interested." 797. Even if McCrudden's story was true, it is unsatisfactory. It is ridiculous to suggest that an unknown worker making an unsolicited approach in the absence of work references could be considered for appointment as a delegate. It is ridiculous to suggest that McCrudden could uncover that Moloney was a Hells Angel without also uncovering that he was currently awaiting trial for the vicious bashing. It is ridiculous to suggest, given all that is known about the blood loyalty of bikies to their gangs, that a casual request by Jerry McCrudden would be enough to make a member of the Hells Angels drop his colors. 798. By itself, McCrudden's account is obviously untrue. Moreover, the other person McCrudden says was present during the conversation, Rob Janjic, denies he was there and denies ever meeting Luke Moloney. 799. When Joe Miles was asked about this incident and how it came to be that a violent bikie had become a delegate, Miles came up with an equally implausible story. He said that it was the workers who wanted Moloney as their representative and that the workers voted him up. Miles' account is untrue. The appointment was made in the absence of any vote by the workers. 800. There is something more sinister about all of this, something which suggests a degree of organization. 801. There were 3 men involved in the bashing. Luke Moloney was made a delegate on September 13, 2023. Cain Montebello was made a delegate on December 11, 2023. Julian Asafiri was made a delegate on August 17, 2023. 3 men, who happened to be involved in the one bashing, were each made delegates within a period of 4 months. That is clearly not a coincidence. 802. It was obvious that someone in the CFMEU at the time had agreed to some kind of deal to reward these men. We can only guess at the motive. Case Study 11. Everybody gets to EAT. 803. In the body of this report, there is reference to the occasion when Harry Cora spoke freely to a supposedly crooked contractor looking to buy his way into a lucrative CFMEU EBA. What Corus did not know was that the contractor was an undercover agent and that the conversation was being recorded. 804. Excerpts from the conversation have been set out earlier in the report. It only seems fair to Corus to recount the whole discussion. This is it. The only speaker is Corus. I have a 30-year relationship with the union. I have a very good relationship with them. And you would know now the biggest union is CFMEU. They're very clever in how they do business, and they don't give out EBAs that easy. And the reason why is because they control the market. The big build is theirs. You can't get in if you don't know someone. Not gonna happen. So, I'll tell you, the bosses are all my friends. We all grew up together. I will take this to them. They're gonna ask me 2 questions. 1, why am I helping you, okay? And 2, they want to eat. Because what they have to do, they have look at the big build. They look at it and say, all right, this is yours. To put you there, they have to move someone. There's a fee to get an EBA. The case studies. I think the upfront fee is cash. But all you've got to do, I told you, pay the boys, make sure they're okay. And that's it. That's business. And everybody gets to eat. 805. It seems appropriate to leave those words there without comment. Case Study 12. 806. 807. 808. 809. 810. 807. And 13. 814. 815. 816. 120. A case studies. 814. 814. 816. Faruk Orman. 819. Cameron Buzzacott owned a labor hire business, Zancott Knight. By early 2022, the business was failing. It could not win contracts due to its inability to secure a CFMEU EBA. Buzzacott had spent months trying to get CFMEU support for an EBA. Buzzacott then approached Cain Pettifer, who he thought could assist. 820. Buzzacott says Pettifer introduced him to Faruk Orman. Orman is a very close associate of Mick Gatto. 135. Through Gatto, Orman had obtained very close connections with the old executive of the CFMEU. 821. So Buzzacott and Pettifer went to Orman and agreed to pay him $250,000 to get them an EBA. Orman did so using ZK Infrastructure Pty LLD, a company name selected by Buzzacott and Pettifer as the applicant. 822. Originally, the deal between Buzzacott, Pettifer, and Orman was for 2 EBAs, one in the field of civil infrastructure, the other for demolition work. Orman put a price of $250,000 for each, and eventually Buzzacott and Pettifer decided only to buy one. The Civil Infrastructure EBA. 823. Usually, the process from the making of an application to the point at which the CFMEU approves an EBA takes months. The checks and processes are complex and take time. Special treatment was given to Orman. He applied on September 6, 2022. By September 9, 2022, it was approved and granted. Only days later, Orman transferred ZK Infrastructure Pty Ltd to Buzzacott and Pettifer. 824. The speed with which the matter was dealt is only explicable by favorable treatment of Orman. The particular person within the CFMEU who supported Orman's application was the senior vice president, Joe Miles, who claimed barely to know Orman. Case Study 14, Billy Mitris, Elias Spernovasilis, and X-Force. 825. Daniel Salter conducted business in NSW as a labor hire supplier. His businesses had failed and workers had been left unpaid. Salter became a kind of enemy of the NSW CFMEU and was unable to get a labor hire EBA in NSW. So Salter moved to Victoria. 826. Salter was an ex-serviceman. He went to Victoria with a proposal to set up a specialist labor hire business employing ex-servicemen. His rationale was that veterans often leave military service with personal problems and, as a group, were disadvantaged and vulnerable. In accordance with the social procurement framework in Victoria, disadvantaged and vulnerable groups are given favorable treatment in terms of acquiring work on the big build. Salter's claim was that he could assist veterans and at the same time pursue a potentially lucrative line of business. 827. So Salter had a business plan. It appeared to be a good plan with reasonable prospects of success. In preparation, he had registered a clever name for the business, X-Force Logistics, 828. All he needed was a CFMEU EBA, 829. Salter had several meetings at the CFMEU office on Elizabeth Street. At different times, he met with John Setka, Derek Christopher, and Elias Spernovasilis together or separately. Positive noises were made, suggesting that Salter would be given an EBA, 830. But the invitation to apply for an EBA never arrived, 831. After months of getting nowhere, Salter was advised to approach Billy Mitris. Salter was told that Mitris had very strong connections with the power brokers in the CFMEU and could use his contacts in the CFMEU to get an EBA for a price. 832. Mitris did have very strong connections within the CFMEU. His principal contact was through a long-term friendship with the Assistant Secretary Elias Spernovasilis. Mitris was friendly with John Spernovasilis, the father of Elias. Through that, Mitris became friendly with Elias and they became close. Elias was Mitris's best man at his wedding. Mitris's son's middle name is John, a tribute to Elias, his father. Elias is godfather to that child. Mitris and Elias are so close they describe each other as brother. Figure 26, the brothers, Billy Mitris and Elias Spernovasilis. 833. Salter did not know Mitris but made contact and asked Mitris for assistance. 834. Even before the meeting, Salter was aware that people were paying bribes to acquire labor hire EBAs. He had heard that people were paying $100,000 or more. He was concerned because he did not have that kind of money. 835. Salter explained to Mitris what he wanted, and the two had a conversation about the money. Salter, well, what sort of figures are you talking about? Mitris, you have to work it out. Salter, I only have $10,000, so 5 or 10 grand. Mitris, call it a consulting fee, 10 grand, 836. Mitris said he would do it, but only if he was given an equal share of the business. Mitris also told Salter that the new business had to be solely in Mitris's name, even though it was owned in equal shares. 837. A $10,000 payment is way under the market price to be paid to get a labor hire EBA. The usual CFMU price is $250,000 to $500,000. The case studies. 838. After Salter agreed to pay the $10,000 and to split his business, he asked Mitris how he could get the EBA, and Mitris responded, I am going to insure it through my brother. He is my best friend. It will all be done. After Salter in 39. Salter paid the $10,000 to Mitris's accountant, describing it as consultancy fees, 840. On February 16, 2022, the Fair Work Commission approved X-Force receiving a Veterans Employment and Training Enterprise Agreement. The significance of the reference to veterans is that, as such, the proposal should get preferred treatment from contractors seeking to meet their social procurement obligations. Figure 27, the EBA granted to X-Force. Note the reference to the EBA being for Veterans Employment and Training. 841. This is an example of just how absurdly the social procurement guidelines work. The approved EBA was signed by Mitris and identifies him as the general manager of X-Force. Mitris is not a veteran and has no connections with veterans. There is no obligation on X-Force to actually employ veterans, and no means of knowing whether it does. Obviously, Mitris was not interested in veterans. Salter may have had good intentions, but for Mitris, the word veteran was used simply to gain benefits under the procurement framework. Figure 28, the page with Mitris's signature. Note the description of Mitris as general manager. 842. Naturally, there were several discussions between Mitris and Salter during the period the business was starting up. Salter quickly realized that Mitris had no skills, no experience, and could not run a business like this. Still, Mitris was confident of success and would say things like, we will have 30 or 50 guys on site. One conversation they had went, Salter, will we get the work? Mitris, Vegas is the secret. He's my mate. We can make things happen. 843. Mitris went on. Mitris, we can get 50 to 60 men out there. Salter, what if we don't win on merit, on our tender? Mitris, it doesn't matter who wins the tender. The union shuts them down. They make things too hard for them. 844. From other discussions, Salter found out that the shutdowns were site closures manufactured by the CFMEU, usually on the basis of safety issues. 845. In fact, X-Force never took off. The business was a flop. It was unable to compete with the other larger labor hire businesses, which Salter suspected were getting favorable treatment. It was only ever able to get a handful of workers onto the many sites around Melbourne. The margins were so tight that Salter himself returned to working on the tools and his partner, unpaid, did the bookwork. 846. Meanwhile, Mitris was making money from the deal. On paper, he was the sole proprietor of the business and he skimmed any profits off the top. Salter has records which show Mitris took out $175,000 for himself. That was all the money the business ever made. Mitris used it to service one of his mortgages. 847. When X-Force collapsed, Mitris simply walked away from the business. Case Study 15. Mick Gatto's M Group. 848. Mick Gatto owns a number of companies within the M Group. 849. There is no doubt that M Group companies have received favorable treatment from the CFMEU, and this is a big business. One company in the group generated $32 million in 2024, and it was estimated that it would earn $52 million in 2026. $852 million. Got favorable treatment and were showered with CFMEU benefits because they were owned by Gatto. 851. Gatto, of course, denies he owns the M Group companies, but that is transparently false. The attempts to conceal Gatto's involvement are crude. 852. When the original M Group entities were set up, they were established and owned by Gatto's company, Arbitration and Mediation Services, Pty Limited. It is true that Gatto then ostensibly sold his shareholding, but he sold it to a company named Tago Pty Limited. The shares in Tago are owned by Sarah Jane Awad. Her maiden name was Sarah Jane Gatto. She is Mick Gatto's daughter. 853. Since then, the directors of the M Group companies have been Tony Paragalli and Michael Portia, who are very clearly frontmen for these and other Gatto business ventures. An ASIC search of the M Group companies shows that none of the shareholders have beneficial ownership of their shares, i.e., they hold them on behalf of another unidentified person. This is the typical method used by someone wishing to disguise or conceal the true ownership of a company. 854. Paragalli and Portia make unlikely candidates as building contractors. 855. Paragalli must be a very busy man. In addition to his work at General Resources and the various M Group companies, he has been a director of at least 34 different companies in recent years. He covers fields of business as diverse as beauty products, asset management, investment advice, high-tech, communications, transport. He has even been a director of Wallenius Wilhelmsen. No, not the Scandinavian shipping giant, just a company based in Pascoe Vale South. 856. Portia is not far behind. He has been the director of 28 companies, and judging from the titles of his companies, his business skills spread as wide as security services, transport, hotels, telecommunications, and industry training, amongst several others. He also seems to manage people's assets from a company based in a street in Airport West. 857. It is quite plain that Paragalli and Portia are dummy directors, but for whom? 858. Gatto has told third parties that it is he that owns the M Group companies. 859. 860. Another sure sign that the M Group companies belong to Gatto is that the CFMEU has shown the companies inexplicable favoritism. 861. Companies in the M Group have received at least 10 CFMEU-endorsed EBAs. Bearing in mind that the CFMEU hands out very few labor hire EBAs, it is a matter of note that M Group companies have received 5 labor hire EBAs from the CFMEU since 2016. Given that traffic control EBAs are highly sought after, it is notable that M Group companies received 5 traffic control EBAs from the CFMEU since 2015. 862. Then there is the favoritism toward M Group companies shown by the CFMEU organizers and delegates. Several accounts were provided that organizers were insisting that M Group companies be preferred. As explained elsewhere, organizers and delegates are highly influential in terms of deciding which contractor will be awarded a job. The mere suggestion that one firm be preferred over another carries with it an implicit threat that the failure to do so will lead to industrial disruption. 863. There are many stories of this kind of preferential treatment. One example will do. 864. 867. In 2017, one company, M Group Construction Services, Pty Ltd., was forced into liquidation owing the ATO over $700,000. That stopped nothing. Other M Group companies took over the work and continued to receive CFMEU support. 868. But that $700,000 was flimsy compared to the next instance. In March 2025, M Group Trades and Labor Pty Ltd. were placed into administration, owing over $13.8 million to the ATO. 869. The suspicious circumstances surrounding the liquidation resulted from years of preparation. In 2016, M Group Trades and Labor Pty Ltd. was registered. The only director was Michael Portia. About 6 months later, M Group Construction Services Pty Ltd. was put into liquidation over the $700,000 tax debt. Portia resigned as a director only 3 months before the company went into liquidation. An ATO demand to pay the tax was made on his successor, and Portia seemed to have escaped any consequences. 870. All of the workers and all of the work of M Group Construction Services were then transferred to the new company, M Group Trades and Labor. 871. Although that company generated in excess of $30 million in 2024, it went into administration with the huge tax debt in May 2025. 872. In what seems to be an extraordinary piece of good luck, Sarah Awad sold her shares in the company on November 25, 2024. In what seems to have been an extraordinary misjudgment, her shares were purchased by Michael Portia, who should have been the person best placed to see the financial fragility of the company. 873. Despite the second company's collapse, nothing appears to have changed. Sources made contact to say that after the collapse was reported in the newspapers, the same employees of that M Group company came back to the same sites to do the same work. One telephoned from a site to say he was standing and watching Gatto's jobs continuing as though nothing had happened. There has been no dent in Gatto's work. 870. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this is that it is occurring on Victorian government sites funded by Victorian taxpayers. 875. It is not credible that those behind the awarding of EBAs to M Group companies were unaware of the connections with Gatto. Everyone knew. The matter was reported in the newspapers. If the persons awarding the EBAs were aware, then, if they were doing their job honestly, they would have asked questions. 876. This makes it difficult to understand, in light of the administrator's direction to senior officials to terminate relations with Gatto, how the CFMEU can continue to give EBAs to M Group companies. 877. There are two instances of this. On January 22, 2025, an M Group company received a labor hire EBA with a 3-year term. On February 27, 2025, an M Group company received a traffic control EBA for a 2-year term. Case Study 16. Gatto, we can cause you grief. 2 developers, 78. In January 2021, 2 developers, Sapporo and Cortina, entered a contract with a builder, Cobalt, to build a 10-story block of apartments in Collingwood. The contract was for around $10 million. The relationship between the developers and the builder soured and work ceased. 879. On October 4, 2023, Sapporo received a call from Mick Gatto, who told Sapporo he was representing Cobalt in the dispute between the developers and the builder. Sapporo made excuses and terminated the conversation. 880. On October 5, 2023, Sapporo called Gatto and taped the call. This call contained a threat from Gatto. 881. At the outset, there was clarification as to whom Gatto was representing. Sapporo, are you ringing on behalf of Cobalt? Gatto, yeah, we're ringing on behalf of Cobalt. 882. The conversation continued, and the areas of dispute between the developers and the builder were discussed. The conversation then turned threatening. Gatto, I know you're speaking to Lings and trying to get Lings to come and finish the work. 883. This was correct. The developers had spoken to executives at Johns Ling with a view to having them complete the building work. Discussions were advanced. Heads of agreement had been exchanged. 884. Gatto then said in respect of the construction work resuming, Gatto, I can stop anyone doing anything, mate. 885. This, obviously, was an assertion by Gatto that he had the power to stop work on any site at any time. This is where the CFMEU comes into the picture. As will be explained, Gatto admits that he had that kind of power within the CFMEU. 886. In this context, Gatto continued his statement to Sapporo. Gatto, we can cause you grief. I know you've got enough grief in your life already. 887. That is obviously a threat. 888. In an interview with the podcaster Sam Newman, Gatto referred to this incident. He boasted that he was an effective debt collector because, once aware that he was involved, those he approached would capitulate. Gatto explained to Newman that this was because they're worried about my union connections, and maybe I can cause them grief that way, which I probably could. 889D. In fact, Gatto was speaking the truth. He was able to stop the work. 890. As mentioned, the developers had been speaking to Johns Ling. Heads of agreement had been exchanged. Shortly after Gatto became involved, Johns Ling pulled out of negotiations. Cortina spoke to an executive at Johns Ling, Daniel Michaeljohn, who told him, we are getting a lot of calls from the union. We are going to meet with them. We have people who deal with the unions. Another executive at Johns Ling, Lindsay Barber, then told Sapporo that Johns Ling could not sign because they would be made to suffer on projects around Australia. 891. Attempts by the developers to get other builders met with similar problems. 892. Around this time, the developers were approached by a CFMEU organizer, Andrew De Bono. De Bono is known to be closely connected to Gatto. It is not clear how or why De Bono became involved. The site was not a CFMEU site, the site was inactive, and the site lay outside De Bono's patch. It seems De Bono must have been brought in by Gatto. 893. It is very plain that Gatto was doing precisely what he threatened to do, cause the developers grief. It is equally plain that he was using his union connections to cause the trouble. 137. This was during an episode of Newman's podcast, You Cannot Be Serious. Episode 2 and an episode of Newman's podcast, You Cannot 94. But that is not an end to this story. 895. The developers continued in dispute with Cobalt, and the matter went to court. In several interviews, a proprietor of Cobalt, Christian Munn, emphatically denied that he had ever retained Gatto in any capacity. Munn's claim appears to be incorrect. Gatto's business partner, John Corey, actually attended the building site. Corey told a security guard to open the gate on the site, and when that was refused, Corey directed the security guard to tell his boss that he would come back and will take all his stuff on Monday or Tuesday. Corey even left a calling card when he was refused access. Figure 29, John Corey's calling card. 896, and it gets even more curious when it is known that, around that same time, Cobalt made payments to a company set up by the accountant Charles Pellegrino. Pellegrino and his companies are known to be associated with Gatto and Corey, and collects money on their behalf. 139. 138, for example, see, nobody will admit they're behind Mick Gatto's famous phone call, but he seems sure. The Sydney Morning Herald, September 13, 2025. 139. C. Nobody will admit they're behind Mick Gatto's famous phone call, but he seems sure. The Sydney Morning Herald, September 13, 2025. Case Study 17. Muhammed, Sayan, and the Tobacco Wars. 897. On July 30, 2025, a CFMEU health and safety representative, Muhammed Hassan Sayan, was arrested and charged with the murder of a violent underworld figure. 898. The background is that at 3 p.m. on Saturday, the 7th of October 2023, a number of gunmen wearing balaclavas entered the busy car park of a suburban shopping center in Craigieburn. The men opened fire on a car with 2 occupants. They murdered one and seriously injured the other. Bullets were sprayed around near members of the public. 899. The man who was killed was Robert Issa, one of the most violent gangsters involved in a gang war over the control of illicit tobacco distribution. The other man who was shot has not been identified and his condition is unknown. 900. There is no doubt that the shooting is related to the tobacco wars enveloping Melbourne. There are 2 rival gangs battling for control of the hundreds of millions of dollars to be made from the sale of illicit cigarettes. Violence has been escalating. There have been numerous firebombings and several murders. Issa was a prominent leader of one of the 2 rival gangs. Issa's murder had obviously been ordered by the other gang involved in the tobacco wars, a syndicate which has been described in the press as a Middle Eastern crime gang. 901. On July the 30th, 2025, 4 men alleged to be responsible for the shooting were arrested in Melbourne. Another was arrested on his arrival in Greece. One of the men arrested in Melbourne was Muhammed Hassan Sayan. Another was arrested. At the time of his arrest, Sayan had recently been appointed as a CFMEU HSR 903. According to the scant records retained by the CFMEU, preparation for the appointment of Sayan started on February 13, 2024, when Sayan sent an email and CV to Ross Jamona, the general manager of Vamp Cranes. Jamona is a convicted killer. It is not clear whether Jamona had solicited the email from Sayan. 904. Vamp Cranes is a controversial firm. It is said to be owned and controlled by a Middle Eastern crime gang involved in the tobacco wars. In the South Australian Parliament, Vamp Cranes was described as having deep suspected links to Middle Eastern organized crime and drug trafficking and recently targeted by firebombings. 905. On February the 20th, 2024, Giamona sent an email to Paul Tsimas, a CFMEU organizer, asking Tsimas to look at the resume. Perhaps presciently, Giamona suggested that Sayan might be consistent with the core values of the CFMEU. Giamona added, "I will bring him in on Friday for a quick 5 minutes meet and greet." Figure 30, 906. There is nothing to suggest that Tsimas checked any of the claims made on the CV. 907. The next record held by a CFMEU is a pro forma document titled Delegate Safety Rep Form. Figure 31. 908. This form is problematical. 909. Sayan is marked down as employed by Viscon on a job at the Fabric Apartments in Caulfield. There are a number of Viscon companies and all have a connection with Stefan Frenkel. Frenkel has a separate connection with Vamp Cranes. In 2022, a trade journal, Cranes and Lifting, described Frenkel as the new business owner of Vamp Cranes. 142. 910. In the section directed at his election, the original entry is that Sayan was elected by Paul Tsimas, but that is crossed out and replaced by Workforce, and the date Sayan was elected is marked TBA, meaning that the date was to be advised, but no date was ever advised. That suggests there was no election at all, and that conclusion is consistent with other information. 911. In the section which specifies Sayan's appointment, he is marked down as both a delegate only and as a delegate and OHS rep, which is impossible. 912. In the section directed at training, there is no information at all. There are no records of Sayan ever receiving the compulsory CFMEU training as a delegate or as an HSR. 913. Finally, the evidence seems to indicate that the appointment took effect on June 25, 2024, which is puzzling because Sayan was not a member of the CFMEU before that date. 914. The only conclusion available is that Sayan was appointed as a favor to Giamona, or someone behind Giamona, and that Tsimas broke a number of rules to achieve that. 915. This was obviously a favor, but to whom? And why were they owed the favor? Case Study 18, 916, 918, 916, 919, 920, 921, 922, 920, 924, 919, 917, 927, 928. The case studies.